It's always an issue. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. For those I've not met, I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome you today to both here in person, but also those joining us online, and I know there are quite a lot, for this conversation on geopolitics and energy security, a Brussels conversation. And you might ask, why is it necessary to say a Brussels conversation? Well, one of the reasons, apart from the obvious, is that this is actually the second in a series of conversations. The first one was in Washington some months ago, and it's part of a series that we're doing in collaboration with CSIS in Washington, and also with the great support of the Public Power Corporation of Greece. We're very grateful for that. And before I turn to the CEO of the Public Power Corporation, Georgios Stasis, for a few remarks, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a roadmap to what we're going to do today. Basically, we've divided this day with suitable coffee breaks in between into three sessions. The first to talk about the wider geopolitical environment and how it bears on the energy security equation as we see it on both sides of the Atlantic. And the second will get more into detail on the energy picture in terms of technology, in terms of value chains, in terms of what is new, in terms of what is old perhaps too, but in much more sectoral detail. And then finally, we're going to look much more closely at the transatlantic element here. There have been some things happening on both sides of the Atlantic in the last weeks, lots of changes at the political level, obviously. Obviously, these will have implications for energy policy, and we want to look at this question of whether the United States and Europe can be on the same page when it comes to energy and energy security. So we'll do that. So thank you again for joining us. We're very, very delighted to have Georgios Stasis with us today for some opening remarks, and then we're going to sit and have a little bit of a short conversation afterwards. George, if I may, thank you for being with us. George is the CEO of the Public Power Corporation in Greece since 2019, and he comes to that role from years of senior positions in the energy sector, especially in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, with Enel above all. And I think it's fair to say that since coming to taking over the Public Power Corporation of Greece, you've really turned it into a powerhouse, both in Greece, but also, interestingly for our conversation, in terms of Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe more broadly, and it's an interesting window into what is happening for the future. So we're really delighted to have you with us. George, share some thoughts with us, and then we'll have a little bit of a chat before we get into our first session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So, good afternoon to everybody. Dear Ian, ladies and gentlemen, it is a privilege to be here today, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on two of the most critical issues facing not only in our region, but the world today: geopolitics and the energy security. The dynamics of energy supply are coupled with geopolitics, and nowhere is this more evident than in Europe. Today, the global energy market is shaped by challenges ranging from geopolitical conflicts that involve both physical and cyber attacks and industrial competitiveness, to the push to decarbonization and the impact of climate change. With energy prices fluctuating and supply chains disrupted, we've seen firsthand how vulnerable we are when we rely too heavily on a single source or even a single route for energy. To solve the energy security equation, there are three components: diversification, innovation, cooperation. Energy is not just a commodity, it is a currency. It is a foundation of economic stability and security. The choices we make today are not only shaping the energy landscape, but influence the economic prosperity of our region. This is something that we in PPC, we know very well. For over 70 years, PPC has been the producing and has been the power infrastructure producing and selling electricity in Greece, developing and also grids and distribution networks, and lately not only in Greece. With our robust and aggressive decarbonization and expansion plan over the last 5 years, both in terms of countries as well as our transition activities, we are today by far the biggest utility in the Southeast European region. So our role and responsibility is bigger. It lies beyond the Greek borders. It is to safeguard energy security in the wider region and through affordable and innovative solutions to drive growth and progress. Southeast Europe is positioned at the crossroads of critical energy transit routes. And as such, we have a key role to play in the broader European energy security and growth. Decarbonization is no longer a matter of choice or belief only on the climate change or not. It's a matter of energy security nowadays, using our resources, and it's a matter of affordability. What we have in abundance in Europe is wind in the north and solar in the south. At the same time, we have better cross-border connections in the west and less developed ones in the east, which can be noticed almost every summer, if you see the last summer, and every winter as well, on the day-ahead prices. But the benefits you can get by complementing these sources across borders are great. And these are cost competitive. And this is exactly why we develop renewables across the region. To really ensure security of supply, though, you need more for the times the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. This is why we also invest in flexible generation, in hydros, batteries, and gas. And these technologies deliver value. In addition, energy security is not only a matter of supply, it's also about the infrastructure that connects us. Strategic investments in the modernization of energy infrastructure and innovative solutions are needed. That's why we heavily invest in distribution networks across the Southeast European region, creating more interconnected and resilient energy network. Regarding the third pillar, cooperation, this is critical both in terms of cooperation between European regions as well as with strategic partners. In this new world, where homegrown electricity produced by renewables increases, new dependencies are emerging. We need to make sure we don't replicate dependencies in the green transition as Europe had in the traditional energy space. To deal with this, we need to develop certain industrial activities in Europe while also engaging in strategic partnerships. The United States and Europe have a long history of collaboration. Without the US LNG, Europe would have been at a very difficult situation without obvious alternatives. In the areas, therefore, of critical raw materials and equipment and digitalization, I believe there is a very big scope of collaboration and partnership. By leveraging the strength of partnerships, enhancing regional cooperation, and embracing the energy transition, we can create a more secure, prosperous, and sustainable future for all. Thank you very much.
George, thank you very much. Please. George, thank you for those remarks. And you managed in a few minutes to say, a great deal, frankly, that is of interest not only to Brussels conversation, but also to a transatlantic one, which leaves us a lot to talk about. We'll have a lot of opportunities to talk about, come back to some of these themes during the day, but we wanted to take just a few minutes at the start to have a little bit of a chat with you, to elaborate on some of these things, and maybe even pick up on one or two comments or questions that there may be. And maybe I could start out by asking you about this whole question of, obviously this is a different kind of conversation that we're having about your sector than we would have even a few years ago. And one of the aspects clearly is the nexus between energy and digitalization, and the role of digitalization in the economy that you're dealing with. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yep.
Okay. About digitalization.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question, because as the world is developing and we are becoming more connected and digitalized, there are, for instance, cyber risks, cyber security risks, but there are also very big opportunities from this digitalization in order to become more competitive. On the cyber issues, I think you can take a look on NIS2, which is the framework that the European Union has put together, is in the correct direction. But I have to admit that our sector is a little bit lacking behind, I would say, versus other sectors. There are different speeds. In PPC we have worked a lot in that area, in the digitalization. I can say that we are one of the few utilities we have been 100% cloudified, which is the base to start all your data analytics and all the activity for taking the digital journey. Digitalization is impacting a lot the market, is creating new services, demand response, new advanced energy services, and it's creating, it's an area of big, let's say, improvement in the competitiveness. And then again, because we're talking also in Europe and the heart of this transformation in the competition, how Europe will increase its competitive work, its competitive activity. There is a lot of discussion about AI now in digitalization is the next step, in particular AI training, whereby I can say that there is already a very big, in my opinion, how can I say, it's a race who will conquer first the AI between, if I may say it, the West and the East. And that's an area where I think Europe should ally and will collaborate with the United States, because both of us, we need to find the ways and the places where we will host the infrastructure for making this AI training. And I think this has to do about not only competitiveness, but energy security of the future of our continents and power, let me say. So this new, for those who are familiar, these new data centers, these mega data centers, will require enormous amounts of power. So there you have the digitalization you mentioned in the start, how it impacts our business, but then how our industry is impacting the digitalization as well, because we need to find the places where there will be safe location to host these data centers, and we're gonna need enormous amounts of energy, hundreds of thousands of capacities, new capacities, and I think in Europe we need to work a lot of that, and in collaboration with the States as well.
George, thank you. And presumably these new amounts that are going to be required are maybe in new places as well. And I'm wondering what technologies, even policy approaches could help Europe adapt to that. I mean, is it going to be more nuclear, small modular nuclear, other things? What do you think is necessary?
First of all, because I told you, I think it's a race. And having a race, you need to host immediately. And if you want to host immediately, it cannot be with nuclear. To do a new nuclear, you will need 10, 12 years. Even the SMRs, it needs to be proven as a technology. For sure, one day we probably go there. But if we want to deliver tomorrow morning, in the next 2-3 years, we will need to use mostly renewables and gas. I don't see any other solution to have the most competitive way to power. But it's a very complicated exercise also from the grids. You can imagine when you will need to set up 1,000 megawatt of data center in any country, it's impossible to do it right now. So most probably we will have off-grid solutions and on-grid just a part of that. And I think the big part of the industry is working in this direction. Likewise, also in PPC, we are thinking of how to resolve these exercises.
I mean, I want to turn to all of you for a minute or two as well afterwards. But you mentioned dependencies briefly. I mean, clearly there are a lot of opportunities out there and a lot of uncertainties as well, but also some dependencies that are arising. So just looked at in particular from a European point of view, what concerns you there? Yeah.
Of course, as the market is becoming more dynamic, there are the interdependencies change the way they were in the past. We've spoke about digitalization and how we will position ourselves from the AI race, and this is one sort of dependency and how we should answer as Europe. But then again, we go to the fundamentals. What has happened and what's happening in Europe in the last years, we can say it is in the correct direction because we are reducing our dependency to the Russian gas, and we are also investing heavily in renewables. So we invest literally in the resources that Europe has, which mainly is the sun, the wind, I don't know, our hydros to the extent we have them, and of course gas will play a fundamental role there on the flexibility along with batteries. So the more Europe invests in this wind and sun, what happens is we are becoming more independent from the security point of view, point one. But in parallel, we have witnessed that there is a reduction on the price. So we do this because of energy security. We do this because of economic interest. We do this because of the climate, for all those reasons. So we should do more of what we do, definitely one point. Then, in terms of raw materials, of course, Europe is not controlling all the raw materials that we will need for this transition. I've talked about batteries, lithium, and other elements of raw materials, which, therefore, the way to answer would be to form collaborations with external countries, but, of course, very careful on the kind of partners we do. On one hand. On the other hand, we need to invest substantially, I believe, on recycling. So to make sure whatever raw material enters our continent to be used again and again and again and again. And that would be a very important element, let me say. And last, on the competitiveness, we need to decide what we want to do, what we don't want to do as a continent, and what we must do, let me say. And let me start from the last. I mean, we must be a continent that also invents technology. And we are, it's many decades since we last did so. So we need to invest a lot on our capabilities to invent technology. For sure, this is not PVs anymore. We lost this train. I know I'm referring to the Draghi's report. They are saying there that this is something we just need to take to jump to the free ride of the China, inevitably, because they are supporting this. It's late for us to go on that. But on new technologies, we need to focus, understand which, and invest significantly on those.
George, thank you very much. And before we go to our next session, I just wanted to see if there weren't any comments or questions in the room. We're happy to take one or two. Why don't I go right over there on the aisle and then over here in the front? And thank you. And please do tell us who you are and where you're from. I do, but not everybody does.
I'm Megan Richards. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Two aspects. One relating to storage and renewables, of course, which is super important, and the potential for improving the technology of storage, batteries, or whatever else. And the other thing you didn't mention was geothermal, but with new geoengineering techniques, I think there's potential for this also in Europe. Could you perhaps mention what you think the potential is there?
Yeah, there is potential for geothermy, more potential. In our country there is, and we are working into revealing additional geothermal power. But it has proven that it's taking time to develop. On the batteries, of course, is a technology which we will need in our mix for covering hourly, let's say, fluctuations. And of course, then the pumping hydros. The pumping hydros, I still believe there are room for more, by far more, all over Europe. You can create, I mean, in our case in PPC, we are removing all coal activity and we are left with the land, which we used to do coal, and there are big holes, let me say. And we have projects in filling them in with water and making up a reservoir, down a reservoir to use the pumping hydro. So pumping hydro, batteries, geothermal too, but takes a lot of time, unfortunately. Still people are reacting to geothermy in local societies.
Fantastic. Just over here, if we could, please.
So, Alan Riley, College of Europe. So my observation on all of this is that are we trying to take the Sisyphean rock and push it uphill? And we may eventually get there, but at enormous cost, and having effectively deindustrialized Europe in the process. And is there my question with the path you sketch out, is there a path which is easier, which would get to decarbonization, which would not involve so much monumental levels of effort and cost? And is that a part about realizing that the difficulty with renewables is partly the opposition to all of the actual development of the infrastructure needed on land, particularly with wind? And then you've got all of the issues to do with backup and the costs, effectively creating two systems. Would it not be easier for Europe to build 100 nuclear power stations, get a lot of cost reduction if you build them at scale? And in the meantime, we do energy efficiency and digitalization. So 10 years' time, we've cut our carbon emissions by 80%, and we're there without the cost and without the deindustrialization. And the question is, you know, will we have gone bankrupt by the time we arrive at the nirvana of net zero in the way we're taking it? The question is not about that we need to do it, but the direction of travel. That's what.
Yeah, this is a very valid question, and it's in the mind of a lot of people. So it's a very valid question, and of course we can debate on that in many ways. But I can say that the cost of delaying is very big. I mean, the kind of things we are witnessing. Take a look in Spain, what happened with the floods. There is a cost there, or the wildfires in Greece. There is a huge cost that we don't count very well, but it comes, and we pay for that. This is the first point. The question of nuclear, I mean, personally I'm in favor, but it comes again with a very big cost. Because, I mean, if we see very honestly what has happened in the last years, the latest nuclear put in operation took more than 12, 15 years to be put in operation, and it came in a budget overruns of more than 50%. So when you levelize the cost of energy of that technology, still new nuclear is coming at a very high cost. I'm not excluding, however, the SMRs. People are working on that. We're trying to resolve the exercise to become a commodity technology in order to try to understand if there could be some reasonable cost on a small scale with flexibility which can be used. And I think we should be putting, as an R&D, let me say, both Europe and United States money in the SMR to develop for our future. But what do we have now? Today, the only thing we have is cheap renewables. There's nothing else you can deploy tomorrow morning which is cheaper. And gas to control the fluctuations. This is what you can do tomorrow morning. And we need to do more on that. This is what I'm saying. This does not mean that we should abandon our efforts into innovating in new technologies, hydrogen, SMR, and so on and so forth.
Okay. I'm conscious of our time, but I think we can take one more briefly, and then we'll move on. Please.
Well, thank you. Javier Arias, I'm president of ELEC, European League for Economic Cooperation. I think that the challenge is huge. Yeah. So we have to change the engine of the airplane while we are flying. So this is the reality. But in spite of gas, and I think that was a very, very helpful, still is very helpful to have this LNG supply coming from the US. But in Europe, for many years, we are lagging behind on creating a single energy market. So there is not a single European Union on energy. And this is our home market, as a matter of fact. There is no interconnectivity between many countries in Europe. So countries which are producing excess energy, they are unable to send this energy to the countries which are very much in demand of that. So this is a kind of a simple thing which we have to probably to address in the very short run. So we are talking on grids, we are talking on pipelines, we are talking to making available excess of energy capacity to other countries. So what are your recommendations in this regards? Do you think that this is feasible, is possible, there is a political will behind that? How should we overcome that?
I couldn't agree more to what you said. I mean, the more and more unification of our energy market is absolutely needed, and this requires additional infrastructure on the grid level, and big investments will be needed in the cross-border, especially connections. There is a lot of discussion. I hear of some projects, but we need to accelerate on that. And I think the new Commission will be bolder on that in order to work. It's going to be the results of this free, more available flow of energy from country to country will bring value to our citizens. The only thing I want to add on what you said is also about capital markets unification. We need finally in Europe a single capital market, one operating capital market, because in order to innovate, in order to do investments in all levels, bigger or smaller, we are going for financing. Going for financing, it's easier to go elsewhere rather to go to the local capital markets, and we need to have access to financial instruments which only a common financial institution will do. So I'm adding to the list common energy market, common interconnection, let's say, system, and common capital market framework. Okay.
George, thank you very, very, very much for your remarks.
Pleasure was mine. I mean, I had the
exactly for the conversation, and we're going to continue the conversation.
Yes, I'm going to.
So thank you for staying with us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. So we're going to move into our next session, where we got to talk about the geopolitics hovering above, perhaps behind, however you want to say, of the kinds of things that we're discussing. So please, if I could invite our next speakers to come, Benedetta, Charlie, Max, please. Benedetta, please. That works. Thank you very, very much indeed. We have a wonderful group with us of friends, but also they happen to be the right people to have this conversation this afternoon. And just to my left, Benedetta Berti, who is the head of policy planning at NATO. Charles Kupchan, who is senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and also a professor at Georgetown University, and Max Bergman, who is the head of the program on Europe and Russia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. So thank you all for being with us. Maybe we could turn to you first, Benedetta, to share some thoughts with us about, when you sit in your headquarters, not too far from here, and think about the world at senior levels in NATO, energy security clearly is part of the equation, but how? How are you thinking about this, and what are some of the things that you consider bearing on this equation that we should be thinking about to start our conversation?
Right. Thank you, Ian. Maybe just to start, I would say over the last couple of years, I've been invited to more and more of these conversations: geopolitics, national security, and energy. Geopolitics, national security, and critical infrastructure. Geopolitics, national security, and trade policies. And there's a pattern here. And it's not just that we're not creative, it's that the pattern reflects the geopolitical environment. And the geopolitical environment is one of strategic competition. It's the most volatile and contested security environment we've had in generations. And a defining feature of this strategic environment is our adversaries and competitors are using, in a deliberate and integrated way, kinetic and non-kinetic effects to affect our security, which means that the lines between what used to be solely a trade issue or an energy issue or an economic issue now needs to be looked through the prism of national security, because that's the way our adversaries and opponents and competitors are using it. So that, I think, is particularly evident in a few domains: supply chain security, critical infrastructure, energy security. Trade policies are large, technological innovation. All of these are now domains of competition and contestation. And the flip side of that is we see our soft targets and infrastructure deliberately weaponized against us. So very briefly, if I have to say, what are the top-level considerations? This is, to me, one of the most interesting geopolitical questions, because essentially I see, from a defense perspective and also from a geopolitical perspective, we need to essentially square a circle, which is not easy. And the circle is we need stable energy supply, we need cost-effective energy supply, we need future-proof energy supply, and we need secure energy supply. The first three are easy from a non-security perspective. Stable, because our societies and our militaries cannot function if we don't have stable security, energy security. That's easy. Cost-effective, because we have finite resources, so we got to balance our budget. Again, easy. Future-proof, because we are going to an energy transition, maybe not tomorrow, but in the future, so we need to account for that. All of these are quite easy, but once you add the security element, it's a little bit more complicated to square that circle for two reasons. One is because I think our energy grid infrastructure and supply chain is going to be more and more deliberately targeted, the object of sabotage, deliberate attacks, so it will be a security vulnerability. And two, because our dependencies, so our energy mix choices, will be used against us. And it's all very nice and well to say that we learned from from our one-sided dependency on Russian oil and gas, and I think we have. But when I look into the future and I look at clean energy, well, we have a clear dependency on the PRC. That's also a strategic competitor. How do we square that circle? Is that sustainable? Is that secure? Does that meet our national security consideration? There is no yes or no question, but how do we square this circle? And I think the prior speaker already highlighted some of the elements: diversification, strategic partnerships, investment in working with our allies. That's the way forward, but if we don't get it right, we may actually swap one dependency for another, and in the process, we may be energy efficient, but we are not likely to be able to withstand conflict. And that's what I worry about on the other side of town, back in Aver, where things look very different.
Benedetta, thank you very much. Max, maybe I could turn to you next. You're sitting in Washington, but you follow closely the debates here. And it strikes me that a lot of what we've seen in terms of political choices that have happened over the last weeks, but there are pre-existing big debates, about economic competitiveness, the Draghi report, all of these things, strategic autonomy. All of these, at some level, have an energy and innovation component in them. But many of them are highly dependent on the strategic risk environment. And you follow Russia, I know, as well. So maybe share some thoughts with us about how that looks to you.
Yeah, well, first, Ian, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And this is probably not the panel that you would like to have at a typical energy conference. And in some ways, it says something about the state of the world that we have to talk geopolitics. But I think in some ways, it just extending off of what Benedetta said, that everything is geopolitics now. And that means what the EU does and the actions that the EU is taking, whether that's regulatory steps, whether that's the Green Deal, the Brussels effect is geopolitical. So when we look at the Draghi report, I mean, I see that in it through a geopolitical lens of how does the EU respond to this changing global environment in which strategic autonomy, that debate that Europe has been having over the last 10 years, is just sort of a reality, and how does Europe then go about trying to implement that? I think when I look ahead at transatlantic relations, I see, I think we're in for a really rocky road with a series of collision after collision. And I think it's going to happen everywhere sort of all at once and in multiple sectors. Because what you will have, I think, is that on the security space, an administration that will come in and say, we want to change the bargain. We don't really want to be providing for European security. And then on the other hand, well, they'll also be saying on the economic side, when it comes to fighting with Europe over tariffs, saying, look at what we do for you, Europe, on the security side. So how dare you come back at us on tariffs? On the tech policy side, when we think about Elon Musk and implementing EU law when it comes to social media content moderation. How is the US going to respond to that? I think we're going to see that in every area, and then especially when it comes to the energy and climate side, where the EU has taken a lot of action, and I think it's quite commendable. But now the question will be, what does Europe prioritize? That the Green Deal, I think, is geopolitical. When you are putting in place a carbon tariff, that is geopolitical. That is saying that Europe prioritizes this, and you're doing it for also economic reasons, but has broader geopolitical effects. And you're going to have a Trump administration that says, we hate this regulation, we hate that regulation, that will have a lot of US companies that will be coming to them and saying, this EU regulation is bad. And so I think there's going to be a lot of pressure put on the European Union over what does it prioritize. Does it prioritize its autonomy to make decisions and laws because it thinks that that's in the best interest of Europe, and even if that conflicts perhaps with having tranquil transatlantic relations, it's going to have to make that determination. And then I think the other word that we haven't mentioned yet is China. And then also, how does Europe then seek to balance what will be a Trump administration wanting sort of a very kind of hawkish approach when it comes to China? Does Europe hedge? Does Europe seek to kind of play both sides of that relationship or align with the United States? I think this is going to be a really tumultuous relationship. And I think at the center of all of it, in many ways, is going to be energy and climate issues will be ever present.
Max, thank you very much. And you know, I'm glad you mentioned China. Well, you did it in a little bit of a way too, but you said more about it. And
that's China.
But I mean, I think it's arguably true. I mean, maybe Charlie, you'd like to comment on this among other things. That there are very few things that anyone agrees on in Washington these days. Republicans, Democrats. A harder line on China, maybe one of them, maybe the one, in fact, in some ways. But Charlie, maybe if I could come to you with a broader question as well, which is, you know, we see these forces of mounting economic nationalism, actually on both sides of the Atlantic, especially in Washington, but not just, also in China. And how does that fit with the kind of alliance relationship, the cooperation that you talked about, George, things that we need to do not just in Europe, but across the Atlantic? It seems to me these things are very much in tension, but please share some thoughts with us.
Maybe I'll answer that, Ian, by taking it up another 10,000 feet.
Oh, please.
And sort of trying
We'll get you a parachute.
Okay. And in honor of Benedetta, who's originally from Italy, I'll start by quoting Antonio Gramsci.
Not on my watch.
No, but he is an Italian activist who was thrown into jail for being anti-fascist. And he wrote in 1930 in one of his prison notebooks, "The old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a wide variety of morbid symptoms appear." That, to me, is where we are right now, right? The sort of the old is dying, and by that I mean the social contract of the industrial era as well as a kind of liberal rules-based order that was constructed by the United States and its allies after World War II. Neither is really working anymore, either at home or abroad, but we're not sure we want to let go of it. And because we're not sure we want to let go of it, we're not even talking about the new, what comes next. And to me, that's where Donald Trump comes in. And it's not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a symptom more than a cause of the broad socioeconomic and geopolitical dislocations that define our era. And I don't think that Trump won because everybody agreed with him and nobody agreed with Kamala Harris. Trump won because he wasn't in office. And we're now living through a period in which being an incumbent generally is a pathway to getting voted out, because our electorates are not happy. They're having a difficult time making ends meet. And in general, our political centers are not holding. In the US, I wasn't sure whether our political center was going to hold because we keep going back and forth and back and forth. Now we have an answer. The political center is not holding. And today we find out that the person who was the leading vote getter in the Romanian election is a far right. Had we been in this room a few years ago, I would have said, thank God for France and Germany, the center is holding. I can't say that today, right? And why is it not holding? It's not holding because the system isn't working. And in many respects, Trump, maybe we should say, bring it on. Because if he is anything, he represents someone who is going to take down the old system. If you look at who he's picking, in some ways it doesn't matter who he's picking to be on his cabinet, because what he's really doing is taking anybody who doesn't represent the establishment. Some of them actually know what they're doing. Many of them don't, right? But that's the whole point. He doesn't want folks from the establishment who are going to continue with the status quo. And so the big question in my mind is Trump going to get us from an old order that isn't working to something new? Or is he going to take down the old order and leave us standing in the rubble? And I don't know the answer to that. I have a hunch, but I'm not going to answer it because I want to be more hopeful. But that to me is kind of where we are. And I guess, Ian, just to finally circle back to your question, I don't think that the relationship between Europe and the United States is going to be as bad as Max suggested. In part because I don't think either side has an alternative. We've been through Trump 1. We've been through Obama, who wanted to walk away from Europe. We've been through George W. Bush, who over the Iraq War said, join me or get out of the way. And every time American presidents come back to Europe and Europe comes back to the United States, because we don't have any other people to turn to. And so I don't think Trump's going to withdraw from NATO. It's going to be ugly. There'll be tariff wars. Yes, Trump will try to pump more oil and say that climate change doesn't exist. But he's not going to fundamentally alter U.S. energy. But we'll sell more LNG. But are we going to drill? No, because the energy companies, they don't want to crash the energy price. And so on that front, I don't think we're going to see a lot of change. And in the end of the day, as I said, I think that there'll be economic nationalism. There will be very difficult discussions. But I think the U.S. and Europe are going to hang together through this. And my final comment would be, if I felt Europe were more internally coherent and stronger, then I would say a break with the United States is conceivable. But because Germany is weak, France is weak, Poland and the Baltics are here on Ukraine, Germany and others are there on Ukraine, I think what will happen is that Trump will split Europe. there won't be a consensus on how to deal with him. And in the end, what will happen is that weak Europe will stay within the fold.
Okay, Charlie, thank you. I mean, so I want to get, well, views from the three of you on, this session is actually called Energy and Geopolitics in a Time of Conflict. And there's a war going on in Europe. And one of the sort of hallmarks of Trump's thinking about, well, at least the international policy part of what he was campaigning on, was that give him a week and he's going to stop this thing. This is roughly what he said. In any case, clearly he's in that camp that is looking for an early ceasefire, if nothing else. And I was wondering if the three of you could maybe share a sense of how likely that is and what it would mean, or what the failure of that would mean. And maybe, Benedetta, I'll come to you last because you're going to reassure us, I suspect. We're hoping you're going to reassure us. But maybe, Max, we start with you.
Well, it's a good question, and I'm curious for the views of the other panelists. But I'm very pessimistic that there's going to be any sort of peace agreement, and namely for a few reasons. One, why would Putin agree to that? He's going to win the war. Right now, for Ukraine to continue to fight, President Trump will have to submit a massive supplemental budget to Congress and request like $50 to $100 billion in military support for Ukraine. Now, there's some ways that maybe he could do it a little bit less, but effectively, there has to be a proactive ask from the Trump administration to Congress to get funding for Ukraine. We've been talking all about escalation and NATO membership. The core issue is you have to devote a lot of money. U.S. military can't just give Ukraine weaponry. You have to allocate the money in Congress, and then that enables weapons to flow. And we ran a grand experiment of what would happen if the U.S. turned down the dial on military support to Ukraine when, as of October last year, funding stopped, and the fighting did not stop. That was a point of real weakness on the part of Ukraine. They had the counteroffensive failed, the U.S. funding was in jeopardy because Congress wasn't passing it, and what we saw from Russia was they doubled down. So, I believe in the American power, but I don't really believe in American power can just sort of snap its fingers and bring a Russian leader to the table. So I think what we'll see is faux negotiations from the Russians that will sort of maybe take a pause when Trump comes in, and then there'll be some pointing at who's at fault for firing that shell, and then the Russians will take the opportunity to continue on. There's another year of this. They could win the war, and by winning the war, I mean being in Kyiv. And that's, I think, a real possibility. It's not something that's going to happen in the next few months, but they're on the upward trajectory. So I think what we'll see is maybe the next few months, maybe more action on the energy side. The administration was very wary of going after Russia's energy sector. We saw them sanction Gazprom Bank. Perhaps there's other actions taking, but they're right now trying to escalate as much as possible, but basically put Ukraine in as best position as possible, but then also make it as hard as possible for the Trump administration to undo that. So, but I'm pretty pessimistic about what's ahead right now in Ukraine.
Charlie, add to our pessimism.
Well, first thing I'd say is I think Trump is going to do the right thing. That is to say, give diplomacy a chance. And I don't understand why we've spent the last almost 3 years pretending that Ukraine is going to win when everybody knows they're not. Time is not on Ukraine's side. They're running out of manpower. They're literally wandering around Kyiv and other towns, grabbing young men and trying to get them to go to the front. And we've had a policy. The policy is we're going to arm them and they're going to go fight. But that's not a strategy. The strategy is this is where we're going and this is how we're going to get there in a way that is consistent with available means. And so I think it is in the interests of Kyiv, in the interests of Europe, in the interests of the United States to try to end this war sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, I'm not quite as pessimistic as Max, but I'm not very optimistic that he'll get there for somewhat different reasons than Max. I think that the issue on the table is not territory. That both sides could live with a ceasefire along the current line of contact, or tomorrow's line of contact, or the line of contact on February 1, 2025. And that will be the basis for the conversation. Where I think things are going to get difficult is what else Putin asks for. And they could include limits on Ukrainian forces and permanent neutrality, recognition of Eastern Ukraine as part of Russia, taking down the sanctions. And I think Putin may go back to what he asked for right before he invaded, which is a new bargain on post-Cold War European security, pulling NATO back from the eastern flank. The Poles, the Finns, the Estonians, they're never going to sign off on that. And so the territory, I think we can agree on. The other issues, I think, are going to be extremely difficult to get. And I hope that Trump realizes that a bad deal is worse than no deal.
Okay. Benedetta.
Well, I mean, you will not be surprised when I start by saying that I think the utility of a NATO official speculating about what the president-elect will do with respect to Ukraine is next to zero. So I will not go there. That would be very unwise of me. But maybe just to pick up a couple of points more generally, and I'm not going to go into speculation or scenario building. Again, as an official, I don't think that's helpful. What I will say, however, is that we also need to be careful to underline that Putin's initial war aims, none of those war aims have been met. The war aims was to ensure Ukraine would not be a sovereign, independent country, would not be in a position to determine its own future, and would be occupied directly or indirectly by the Kremlin. In other words, it was about ensuring that there will be no viable Ukraine. Today, Ukraine remains a sovereign country. He has not deleted Ukraine from the map. That was his plan. He has not met his war aims. Yes, the war isn't going. I'm not gonna push back on the fact that there's been very serious cost on Ukraine, but very serious cost on Russia as well. The whole country is mobilized. It's on a war economy. Yes, they can keep going. Yes, they have a high threshold for pain, but they need to rely on North Korean soldiers to do their fighting. That's not a sign of strength in my book. So I just wanted to clarify that I think we also have to not make them look 10 feet taller when in fact they're not. That's first point. With that, the second point that I will make, starting from what I understand European capitals are saying, is that we understand that the stakes here are incredibly high, and that there's essentially two paths. A path where Ukraine remains a sovereign independent country, and Putin's maximalist war aims are not met. That's a path that ensures a modicum of stability in the Euro-Atlantic area, or at least the opportunity to start rebuilding that stability, and that sends potentially a signal of deterrence towards other strategic competitors. There is another path where the war aims are met, and that to me is instability, but very importantly also sending the wrong message to other assertive authoritarian actors like Xi in the PRC in China about security in the Indo-Pacific. So but the playground, the theater where all this is playing out is Europe. And that's my last point. I do not know what the future holds. I have no idea. But if it's so important to us as Europeans, certainly we can dig a little deeper and think about what else can we do to support Ukraine so that when there is a settlement, when there is a negotiation, they go into it from a position of strength. And that's, to me, reasonable because it's also about a fair burden sharing. The United States is carrying half of the load. The war is right here. Well, maybe there's a case to be made for us to increase how much we support Ukraine financially, humanitarian, in terms of military assistance, and to put it in a better position so that when and if there are negotiations, they start from a place of strength. That's all I can say, so I'm not going to go into speculation.
Okay, no, thank you for that. We have a bit of time, and I wanted to go to some comments or questions from our group here, and maybe just right over there, and if you would tell us, Elena, who you are and where you're from. See, I do know who these people are.
I can't tell you because
Up there.
Good. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I am Elena Lazaru from the European Parliament's Research Service, and since there's a lot of Greek people here, from ELIAMEP as well, I'm a senior fellow there. I'm going to lighten this up a bit, asking about what we refer to as the Global South, for lack of a better word. And how I'm going to ask about this is the following. I wonder if energy opens up an opportunity for the organizations that some of you and I and many of us work for, the EU, the NATO, but also the US, to engage with those countries. I'm thinking of the hydrogen in Chile, I'm thinking of the cobalt in Africa, I'm thinking of the nickel in Indonesia. But I'm also thinking that these countries, when it comes to conflict, are voting in rather different ways than we are in some of the institutions where the votes take place. And in general, if they don't vote different ways, there is this whole discourse of double standards going on. So I wondered what you think about energy as a diplomacy area to engage with those countries, and perhaps to Benedetta, because NATO is engaging now with a number of these non-Western partners, how that is panning out, and to also ask you if you see this being an area where the EU and NATO will be doing more going forward. There's been various meetings between the new Secretary General and President von der Leyen, now with Donald Trump. Maybe that would be interesting for Max. Where does energy come in, and how in the future in all these partnerships? Thank you.
Okay. Let me come to you with that question, and then we can go back for one or two others. And, well, why don't you start, Max?
It's a great question. I guess I think it's a little messy. Yeah. Well, no, I think the
problem,
the response, that how this would play out from a foreign policy perspective, because in some ways you're engaging with countries, you're trying to do economic deals, you're trying to develop relationships with countries like Chile because for critical minerals purposes, and that can really build an intense partnership when European companies in particular are engaged in a country. However, there is a coercive side to this, and if the EU is prioritizing climate action and a country is not then advancing, and their companies are being subject to tariffs, which I think rightly, because European companies here in Europe are then taking response, well, that's going to create some friction. So I don't think it's necessarily all one way in a positive way. And I think the way you would make up for some of the friction would be where I'm skeptical that the EU will have the resources to then sort of provide on the kind of governmental or development or foreign assistance side. So I think it's an area of friction. I don't necessarily think that's bad, right? I mean, foreign policy isn't just about providing love to countries. There's usually a degree of power involved in it. And if you think about the topic of economic sanctions, for instance, now we've tried to deploy economic sanctions in a coercive tool to change the decision-making of leaders. But actually, if you think about the climate space, that's an area where actually sanctions could have a real direct impact on just changing the economic incentives of actors that are polluting. But that's incredibly coercive, being seen incredibly hypocritical by the global north, by the European Union. But then, so the question is, what do you prioritize? Do you prioritize not wanting to be hypocritical, your diplomatic relations, or climate? And I think this is where it's geopolitical. The energy discussion, the climate discussion are, I think, looking ahead, going to be very geopolitical. And that is going to put a lot of pressure on how the EU does decision making, because it does regulations, but then oftentimes doesn't really think about what are the geopolitical effects of this and how we implement it. And I think it's going to be interesting.
Just to add to that, I do recognize there is a complexity. I think that's very much the case. There may also be opportunities in a context in which I think that access to critical resources is already part and parcel of strategic competition. And we are in a situation in which the main powerhouse for everything that is related to clean energy is clearly the PRC. We have a direct dependency on them for rare earth minerals, for example, and it's not just it's mining, it's refining, it's manufacturing, it's the whole supply chain. That means broadly that we have not been as active in this space as we probably could have been as the transatlantic community, as Europeans, as the United States, that creates opening for partnership, for trying to bridge the gap, that vacuum that perhaps we have left. It won't always be easy, but I think whether it's on supply chain security, strategic stockpiles, these are issues that will become really important that are already very important for our national security. So we probably should invest more deliberately in partnerships. And yes, it is with the misnomer, but global south, because that is where the capabilities, the resources are. There's also another element. It's about reindustrialization and mining in our own countries. Those are both different paths, but I think they point in the same direction, one in which we have greater access to the strategic resources that we need to ensure our sovereignty.
Okay.
One quick word.
Please, go ahead.
Having flown in this morning from South Africa, I'm even more convinced than before that trip that the old is dying and the new cannot be born, in the sense that whether you're in South Africa or India or Turkey or any country that we consider to be an emerging part of the so-called global south, and I guess Turkey's a bit of a swing country, there really is a sense of we've had it, and that there is a new agency and a new impatience with an international order that they believe to be very, very inequitable. And I'm really quite struck by the degree to which the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was not a very ambiguous event, has left most of the world on the fence. And yeah, in South Africa, they understand what Russia's doing in Ukraine. But as you said, Elena, they're also talking about Gaza. And they're also talking about a UN system in which there is no African country with a permanent seat. And they are heading to the BRICS because that's where they believe that they have influence. And I didn't know this, but there are somewhere between 200 and 250 in-person BRICS meetings per year, right? So, and the South Africans are going to get FaceTime. And just I'll end with one anecdote, which is when the African leaders go to a BRICS meeting or they go to a meeting with the Chinese, the leader stays in the room. And they say, when you go to a meeting in most other parts of the world, the leader comes in, gives a speech, and leaves. That's where we are.
Okay. Right. Just right in the, well, if you'll forgive me, just right in the front here, if I could.
Thank you to the excellent panel. It's a very timely conversation, especially your observations from South Africa. My name is Teresa Fallon. I'm with the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. I mean, the big question here, because we're talking about geopolitics and energy security, is kind of the Russia-China dynamic in all of this. We saw the recent cutting of subsea cables in the Baltic Sea. It's very unclear, what China-Russia's role was in all of that. And recently we saw Scholz's phone call to Putin, and energy was discussed. So I don't think, it seems like there's a lot of fragmentation within Europe. It's a possibility that, the center's not going to hold even within the EU. In 2016, with the election of Trump, we saw at the Munich Security Conference, there was this thinking that Europe could kind of move closer to China at that time in order to balance against the US. So I don't think that that's an option for them now. So how do you see this all kind of playing out? Europeans are desperate for inexpensive energy. Any sort of atomic energy is going to take a long time. Germany shut down their nuclear plants, which were in fine shape. They could have kept them running for a few more years. How do you see this all playing out? Thanks.
Okay, Teresa, thank you very much. And that's actually a very nice question, maybe to come back to the three of you to wrap things up before we move on, to a short coffee break and then our next session. So maybe this time we start with you, Charlie.
Okay.
Just to mix things up.
I guess I'm of two different minds on the Russia-China relationship. Part of me feels like it's very shallow, and I think it is shallow. I think it's held together by a bond between Putin and Xi, and it doesn't have deep roots in either public or in either bureaucracy. In fact, you're not really supposed to say this in public, but the Chinese generally don't like the Russians, and the Russians don't generally like the Chinese. They're both somewhat ethnocentric populations. And it is seemingly a marriage of convenience that could be fragile. On the other hand, it sure looks pretty solid right now. And if I had to bet, it will stay solid. It's not going to turn into an alliance. I wouldn't call it a bloc, but it works for both sides. And the Chinese, I think, are broadly uncomfortable with what's going on in Ukraine. And I think in the end of the day, will be a necessary player in bringing the war to an end. Because if there's anybody who can influence Putin, it's Xi. If there's anybody who can really make it hard for Russia to keep this war going, it's the Chinese. Because even though they're not arming them, they are selling them microelectronics. They are keeping afloat their military-industrial complex. And so if they wanted to make life difficult, they could. So I would say, it's fragile, but I think it is a kind of a geopolitical space that for now will hang together as a counterweight to the West.
Max, please.
I think it's a great question. The way I see it is that I think China sort of has, for a long time, badly misunderstood Europe and has believed that it could sort of wedge Europe and the United States. And that, I think, at times has been useful. So when China was thinking about providing direct lethal support to Russia in March of 2023, there was a lot of flurry of effort. You had Ursula von der Leyen and Emmanuel Macron go to Beijing and say, don't do that because that would have implications for the Sino-European relationship. And then Macron went and sort of created all this daylight with the United States, which actually I think might have been helpful in the sense that China thinks that there's a relationship there to cultivate with Europe that can sort of create some distance with the United States. And I think that's going to be, in some ways, exacerbated during a Trump administration, in which if Trump pulls out of Paris, the U.S. is seen as going backward on climate. I think the Chinese will say climate is a wedge issue in the transatlantic relationship. It's an area where we can maybe develop our relationship with the Europeans. And you've seen some murmurs of this from Chinese officials. And that maybe can sort of pull Europe more towards its side. I'm not sure if it's going to be successful, but what I would say to Europe is, what is the main issue right now here in Brussels when it comes to Beijing-Brussels relations? It's not the military support that China has been providing for Russia's defense industry, it's EVs. Totally important issue, but if the war in Ukraine is the most important thing to European security, and the Europeans aren't going to Beijing and saying, hey, if you keep doing this, there will be consequences. And what China thinks it's doing is staying underneath Europe's red lines, because it's not providing direct lethal support. It's just providing Russia with the means to build the weapons to then kill Ukrainians. And so Europe needs to shift its red lines, but in order to do that, you have to threaten them with retaliation. And that's what we have not seen Europe willing to do. It's in some ways prioritizing the competencies that the EU has, which is to look at EVs. But we have this major security crisis. So I think the question to me is, can Europe have a really cohesive China policy? And how will that then interact with, I think maybe last word, I would sort of push back. Charlie was leaning towards, I think, a second Trump administration, burning down the house. But I think part of that is going to be transatlantic relations. I think will survive, but I think there's going to be tension on all sorts of areas. And where there will be some tendency, I think, amongst European publics to say, the Americans don't believe in climate change and the Chinese are taking action. And that's going to, I think, have a real demoralizing effect on the next generation of transatlanticists, of people believing that there should be a strong Europe-US bond.
Next, thank you. Benedetta, a last word.
Right. Well, I would say if China is uncomfortable with the war of aggression that Russia is pursuing in Ukraine, it certainly has a very funny way of showing it. Very funny way of showing it. Today, China is the single largest enabler of Russia's war of aggression. The reconstitution of the Russian military is progressing at a much faster speed than anticipated, in no small part because of China. So those are the facts, and this is not just about support in being an economic lifeline for the Russian Federation, but it's also about providing those dual-use goods that are essential to the Russian defense and industrial technological base. So it is there. So by taking this role, China is playing a role in the security of Europe. I would very much agree that there should be a response if we actually believe that that role is not consistent with being an internationally responsible player and while we want to trade as business as usual. So I think that would be my first point. My second and last would be that I think intellectually is very interesting and fair discussion to talk about the limitation of the no limits partnerships and whether it amounts or not to an alliance, and to conclude that it doesn't. I would agree, but today, where we are, we see increased adversarial alignment between China, Russia, Iran, and the DPRK. And you see this in Ukraine. So we can speculate about what they hold in their hearts, what they hold in their minds, but de facto, Iran is transferring ballistic missile technology to Russia. Russia is transitioning ballistic missile technology to North Korea. North Korea is deploying 10,000 soldiers in Ukraine. This may be a marriage of convenience, but it's one that for the time being is having a destabilizing impact on Euro-Atlantic security, on Indo-Pacific security, and on the transatlantic community. So I think we need to treat it as such, even though it's true that there may be wedge issues, there may be competition, it may not be a full alliance, but for the time being, they are maximizing each other's foreign policy goals and aspirations, and they are fueling the largest conflict this continent has seen since World War II. So we should probably take stock and do something about it.
Benedetta, thank you.
That's personal view.
Absolutely. Max, Charlie, Benedetta, thank you very, very, very much. Please join me in thanking them. It was a very relevant but also very nuanced conversation. We're going to come back and talk about energy technology and supply chains, but we invite you to a 10-minute coffee break, and we'll rejoin you here. Thank you very much.
Great. Welcome back, everyone. So pleased to be here today. And my name is Joseph Mikett. I spend my days as the director of the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS in Washington. And we're very grateful to be included in the program. What an amazing set of panels we had in advance of this one. Fear not, because of the expertise that we have to my stage left, we're going to have a great conversation as well. 2 points of moderator's privilege, if I may. The first is we put on a lot of events at CSIS, and I will note as a practitioner that this one is being spectacularly run and has incredible attendance. So congratulations to the whole team for putting this together, Ian and everyone. Secondly, one of the things that was so interesting to me, and I hope we get a chance to talk about it in our panel, though it wasn't part of our preparation call, is the assertion that we saw in both the discussion with Mr. Stasis and in the first panel that the sort of energy and climate choices now are like everything is geopolitical, but those are perhaps going to be particularly geopolitical in the next few years. I think that's that's a concept, this idea that's worth us probing. Over the summer, we did a workshop with my research team. We brought 25 climate and trade experts to CSIS. We ran a tabletop simulation. The scenario began in the 2027 G7 with the US, the rest of the G7, and sort of auxiliary countries standing up a climate club, a sort of multilateral trade agreement focused on defining a certain level of climate ambition and then working with allies to develop the right supply chains, to create border tariffs for those outside the club. And we published the report just last month, and the reason why it sticks in my mind is at the start of that, there had to be a very prolonged negotiation between those players representing the United States and those representing Europe about what the formation of that club was going to look like. Would it be something akin to the CBAM? Would it be something more protectionist and aggressive? And I regret to say in this room that the Europeans made some very significant compromises on the nature of energy and climate to be in team with the US and the rest of the G7. So I hope with that provocation, people will check out our paper on that front. But let's begin. The theme of this session is on competitiveness, on energy supply chains, and let me start with the early picture that we've got. The US has low energy prices. We have sort of the best recovering economy globally out of the COVID crisis. And, but especially with our recent election, we may see some backsliding on energy and climate, or on climate, excuse me, even as we have a very forward position on energy. By contrast, our peers in Europe have really grand, interesting, intricate plans for climate. There's a strong alignment in Europe of the climate and the energy security agenda, where in the US that's like probably a little bit more ambiguous. And so one of the things I want to focus our conversation on is how do we learn from each other? And in particular, since I've got 3 European experts up here, I want to understand how, from a US perspective, I should see European thinking in this context. How do we get the phasing right so that Europe can achieve the energy security goals that it has long term? It can achieve the climate goals that it has long term. But we don't have a period in the middle where the new hasn't been built yet and all the old is going away too quickly. You're all involved or have been involved in this, thinking about this issue as practitioners, so I'm really excited to hear your insights and to make sure that they are shared with our audience. Philippe Ducan's the president of ExxonMobil Europe. Philippe, I'd love to begin with your thoughts on managing the transition and really focusing on how do we align competitiveness with the energy security and climate goals that Europe has. Thank you for being here.
No, thank you for the opportunity. And I'm European, born in Europe. I represent an international company that obviously has one big foot in Europe and a big foot outside of Europe. So we always bring these two perspectives, and I'll try to do that today. First thing I would say is big foot in Europe. As ExxonMobil, we have 12,000 employees. We have been investing 20 billion over the past 10 years. We're one of the biggest refiners in the region, so it's a very important region for us. This being said, our strategy is the same as it is everywhere else in the world. It's about meeting society's needs for products and energy in a reliable and secure manner and affordable, and reduce emissions. It's this end equation, as we call it. And I think in many things we heard today, everybody agrees that it's not about just energy or it's not about just about the environment. It has to be about the two of those. The element of the equation on the right side, this reducing emission for us is, I think, a good example of some of the challenges that exist today in Europe. We as a company are investing $20 billion between 2022 and 2027 to reduce emissions. That's part of our plan to be net zero by 2050, scope 1 and 2, for our own emissions. And this investment will go where it's likely to have the greatest impact and to have a return. And unfortunately, right now, when we look at Europe, we don't see how this investment is going to be attracted in Europe versus other parts of the world, US in particular, and we can talk about later a little bit about the difference between those two. We also see major competitiveness challenges for traditional industries. We see the chemical industry in Europe running 10% below its average capacity utilization. We see refineries shutting down. We see regulatory burden continue to pile up. And so in a very short summary, we are here to help Europe win. We are here to help our assets win. And when we think about it, we can summarize in 4 words what we think could be helpful. And the 4 words are reduce, embrace, promote, and support. It's about reducing the regulatory burden. I put it first, and I would say significantly and fast. It's about embracing technology neutrality, probably a topic that was mentioned already earlier today. Very important. The third one is promoting market-based solutions to enable the low-carbon product to win. And finally is to support circularity. And we think with these 4 things, Europe could make a big step, bringing some competitiveness back, and be more attractive for investment.
Let me start with just one brief follow-up. I mean, so as an American in Europe, and one who is, kind of favors textbook economics on a lot of different problems, there is an ETS. There is a carbon price in Europe. It exists. I hear you saying promote market-based solutions, and that when you think about making low-carbon investment, Europe is not necessarily the destination where it's going to be. Can you help me resolve the dissonance there, just very briefly?
Well, first of all, when you look at the ETS, I think it has been a great mechanism, has been very effectively the past 10 years in driving Europe's emissions down, initially in the power sector, and then starting to have an impact on the industrial sector. The challenge it creates, it's one of the sources of uncompetitiveness of the European industry. When you look at competitiveness today, what are very impactful? We talked about energy. Obviously, the energy price here in Europe is higher than in most places in the world, and particularly in the US. Our labor cost is more expensive. Our productivity is not as high as it is in the US. When you look at carbon has a price here, doesn't have a price in most parts of the world. And then we have this regulatory burden that adds to the complexity and risks of doing business here. So the carbon cost, yes, it's a good thing because it creates a market and helps drive emissions down. On the other hand, it's a cost to industry, and in many cases, a cost that industry cannot pass to the market because industry outside of Europe, producers outside Europe, do not have to pay a carbon price and therefore don't have to carry that additional cost on their products.
I see. So there's a comparative competitiveness issue.
Most of our products do trade internationally. There is imports, there is exports. If you have to export, you're not competitive because you have higher cost. And when people import, they have a competitive advantage because they don't pay that CO2 price. So that's one of the examples. And I think when you think about competitiveness, Europe can and has historically been able to offset some sources of uncompetitiveness like energy. Energy is not new. Europe has never competed with US on energy. But then when you put energy, then you put operations costs, labor costs, CO2 costs, regulatory burden, there is no source of competitive advantage left.
And I think that's the end statement.
It's the end statement. It's Europe could. If Europe was great at innovation and could offset part of the energy challenge, that would be great. But even that, when you think about the Draghi report, I think he's very clear at saying Europe needs drastic change. Europe has 4 key objectives, being a heavyweight on economy, being a leader in innovation, leading the world in decarbonization, and having very high social standards. If Europe doesn't make critical changes very quickly, it will meet none of the 4.
Great.
So I'll leave it there. But
We're plenty to come back to, believe me. Let's move to Simone Mori. Simone is a professor at Lewis University, longstanding affiliation with GMF, and has spent a lot of time in industry, particularly the power sector. Simone, I know that at the university you're thinking about this sort of competitiveness, decarbonization, and maybe I could get some of your thoughts, either starting with some of Philippe's comments or just kind of what we've missed so far.
Yes, we are talking quite a lot about this possibility to combine decarbonization and competitiveness, and I believe that we should get rid of all the ideology and the polarization of this debate, because I tend to agree with what you said, but there is something which is very relevant. If you go back to 2009, which is basically the beginning of the European policies, with the proposal of 2020, the targets, it was ETS earlier, but anyway, this was a very important step. And we look at what happened in Europe and comparing the European and US performance, for example, in the next 10 years. There is no academic evidence that all the combination of the complex climate proposals put forward by the Commission impacted on the energy-intensive sector in Europe. There is no academic evidence. Not because in theory, this kind of proposal could not impact on the industry, but because all the kind of ex-post protection put in place in terms of state aid, formally and informally accepted and tolerated by the Commission, basically kept the situation in the same condition that it was before. What is the main difference? The major element of difference between 2009 and 2019 is the fact that the revolution that happened in the US, thanks to the unconventional fuels, especially shale gas, opened the gap of competitiveness between the US and Europe. And this is something that we have to live with. I mean, let's imagine for a while that here there is a kind of meeting of negationists, or that suddenly the Commission becomes a club of negationists. And we say, okay, let's stop tomorrow with all the climate policies. Let's kill the ETS, let's eliminate the targets. May we stay as Europeans in this condition being competitive? No way. No way. We tend to consider Chinese, as bad guys in the game, no? Chinese are by far the most intense investors in green technology. No? We all know that probably 85% of solar panels around the world are produced by Chinese, but we don't know, many of us know that 40% of those panels are built, utilized in China.
Right.
So if you look at the real indicator, the real metrics, for example, the amount of CO2 per unit of GDP, never in the history of the economy, of the industrial economy, as a country was able to increase the intensity of its economy, the carbon intensity, the energy intensity of its economy, faster than China, which is quite impressive. So I think as Europeans, we have to get rid of all, let's say, of all the other ideological narrative that in some way was one of the factors which created this polarization also during the last electoral campaign, which was crazy. Because we need something new, we may not stay. So I believe that going back to what Europe is proposing, I fully agree with the idea of regulation. We must find a way to be faster, cleanest, more lean. Targets probably are needed, because targets gives you a direction. So when Mr. Stasis has to define an investment plan, it needs a direction. Yes, he understands where the direction is, but we don't have to be hanged to the targets. I think that's too much discussion on that.
Yeah.
During the same decade, from 2009 to 2019, we increased, despite all the investment in renewable, we increased the dependency on Russian gas as Europeans. That's crazy. And look what happened last week. I mean, for obscure discussion on some contractual comma between Gazprom and Austrians, the price skyrocketed again.
Right.
So it's clear that we have to go. I believe that the problem is not what we have to do, which is very clear to me, is how we have to do what we need to do. And probably a round table is not enough to discuss all in details, but basically it's clear that we have to deploy as much as possible in terms of renewable. It's clear that we do not have the possibility to incorporate all the value chains on these new technologies, at least for a part of that, and then we have to find a way to reinforce our external dimension in order to create a condition to guarantee the procurement, the provision in a relatively safe way. It's clear that if this is true, for example, for panels, it's not true for batteries, not true for hydrogen, where there is a lot of possibility, potentiality for European industry to play a role. This has been mentioned by Stas's introductory remarks. I mean, there is a lot of work to be carried out in terms of infrastructures, reinforcing the networks, increasing the level of integration of our markets, both infrastructurally, physically, and regulatory. We need to go back quite a lot to the fact that we have underground some resources that may be utilized. Of course, we will get rid of fossil fuels in the next future, but in the meantime, probably we should utilize more in terms of mining what we have here. And there is an enormous space for technologies, circularity.
Well, I mean,
recycling.
Even then, you know, like we heard earlier, a reference to geothermal. And one of the technology innovations that we're all sort of awaiting in the United States is the use of hydraulic fracturing technology to make geothermal available over wider geographies and in many more places. Because it turns out if you crack a rock, you can get oil and gas out, but you might also get heat, right? So seeing some of that innovation happen. The question is, can we make sure that innovation is happening or is scaling in Europe? And for that, we will go to Elena. Elena Giannakopoulou is
close enough.
Is the director of strategy at PPC, and you know, Ellen, I want to hear your thoughts on this because you're in the heart of deploying renewables quickly to reduce costs and increase security. You're at the heart of connecting wider geographies to take care of the diversification challenge. And you and I have talked many times about the need to cooperate on building supply chains so we don't repeat the mistakes as we make this transition of overdependence. When you think about the sort of the challenges that we face, whether it's a market restructuring or it's sort of a supply chain issue, what are the areas that you see the most potential for making sure that new innovations get built and or scaled quickly in Europe?
Okay, so let me say that 5 years ago that we started deploying clean energy at PPC, what we see is that our suppliers, our procurement process, our products have changed completely. And I would agree, you know, the US has very, very cheap gas. What's the Henry Hub, 2.5?
Yeah, something like that.
So in Europe, it's like 6 times up. Like, there is no chance that you can compete with that. You cannot.
Right.
You cannot. No matter how much you're going to get public support, you can't break this. You can't break this point. So what you're thinking is what has already been discussed. Of course, solar, wind, batteries, they help us reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, but they are so much cheaper for us in Europe. That's the truth. It's so much cheaper. Deploying 1 megawatt of solar and wind today in Europe, it's like the cheapest way of producing new units of electricity, and at some points they even undercut the existing stuff. And this is a very hard fact to beat. The question is, what we have today, is it enough to get us to the climate targets? Are we moving fast enough? Because the truth is that there is a very compelling case business-wise. So that's the one fact that this disruption is not gonna change, which speaks to all these discussions we have about supply chains. We need new partners, we need new sources. Of course, we shouldn't repeat the same mistakes that we made with gas. And we need to decide what can be done locally. Because there is just no other way. And to be honest, I don't think that Europe lacks innovation in critical sectors. What it lacks is scale. In order to have a technology, you talked about geothermal, in order to have a technology to break through, you need innovation, you need scale, and you need political support, you need the regulation. So we have, for example, in the Netherlands, one company that builds, the machines that they build chips.
Yep.
But we don't have the manufacturing activity in Europe, and this is the problem of the market union. We need the money, we need the frameworks that will ensure that innovation is translated to manufacturing capacity. And from our end as a utility, as I said, we have changed completely our world. We changed our world, and our world is changing. So we deploy renewables. We try to deal with diversification across countries, across technologies, grids, of course. So, and what we are providing is lower cost of energy to our customers, to the industry included. But then in turn, we need the industry to make sure that they focus and they enhance their manufacturing capacity and they help economical growth in Europe, which is great. But I will also say that for us, time matters. So we need these supply chains, we need this equipment to be ready in time and at the right price.
Right.
And this means, of course, they need support, they need public support, but as I said, there is not also enough money around, I think. You know, we all talk about Draghi's report, which was great, but Leta's report was equally great, and it made some excellent points about money that exists in Europe. Is the capital unions that will help this money flow and help support the industry, manufacture, picking their battles. I completely agree. But then delivering to us as a utility.
You know, I'd love to dig into that just a little bit more. So, the Draghi report was actually surprisingly popular reading in Washington.
It was a long one, but it was a good one.
Yeah. Well, people only read the 40-page executive summary, but but I think everybody likes to see like what do they think they're doing wrong. But as I read it, I think it's like I don't think an unreasonable interpretation of it, at least in the energy side. I don't know, telcos and pharmaceuticals and stuff, whatever. But that transition is a cost, but decarbonization is an opportunity. That's kind of how I read the headline of the report. When you were talking to your peers, in the U.S., we're trying to make decarbonization an opportunity, or at least we did with President Biden and with the Inflation Reduction Act, large subsidy packages for direct to manufacturers, sort of preferential tax credits for using, domestically manufactured goods. I've never quite understood. It seems like, Europeans have historically been better at industrial policy than the United States. So like, where's the gap? Where is thinking right now on how we're going to make sure that some of these value chains pass through Europe, that they benefit European workers? And what are the tools that are available that you think are being underutilized now? And I think I open that to the panel for your thoughts.
Happy to start, because that's at the heart of the challenge, I think. And the heart of the challenge is that in many cases, you have two very different approaches. Europe, big sticks and a few carrots. US, lots of carrots and a few sticks. Another way to say that is, in Europe, and it's back to what you were saying, nobody would agree with the objective, with the what. Yeah. The problem is the how. It's not about telling a company what to do, where to do it, how to do it, and preferably, if they don't, here's what happens. That is going to be successful, when on the other side, we have the US government, the IRA, thinking about what is needed to create a business case that will create investable project, and then making it easy for those who want to participate and compete to come in. And that's the two challenges. That's what we're saying, is on one hand, a very heavily regulated, over-regulated environment, where, in fact, innovation is not free to deploy to meet the objective. You're told what technology to use, you're told by what time frame, and so on and so forth, and then you're provided some subsidies sometime, but they're pretty difficult to get, as compared to what we see here in the US, my US company, which is a pretty simple system of tax break, which sets targets. If you meet that target, you are eligible, prepare your file.
Right.
And so this is creating this dynamic of, when you have the choice, and all global companies have to look at their choices and options, you go for where you think you will have an attractive return on your investment and a support, rather than where you're told what to do with a questionable return. When we look at the IRA and the Net Zero Industry Act, the kind of the European response to the IRA, the Net Zero Industry Act, in my world, tells me that I have to invest in CO2 injection capacity. It's a mandate. Whether it's profitable or not is not even a question. It's a mandate. In the US, if I meet certain standards, I will get support. sorry, but that makes the choice quite easy on where to go and how to do it and how attractive Europe becomes or is. And so it's all this question of what can be done. And I think what can be done really quickly, and Draghi says it, is regulatory burden is something that can be reduced at no cost quickly. And the good examples of that reported in Draghi is reduce reporting burden by 25%, came from the Commission, still in the air, but is here. It's about competitiveness checks. That's not something that has been done over the past 5 years. Are the new regulations and directive going to negatively or positively impact investments and assets in Europe? And then relooking at the entire structure on reporting and due diligence on everything that is sustainable, in particular the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, reporting directive, but there's all sorts of other regulation that contribute to that makes the entire package very complex and very burdensome and could be addressed quickly.
Yeah.
It's good to hear from the Commission that an omnibus regulation is being considered that could be into it. Seen from our side, it's absolutely urgent that something is done.
Right.
The sense of urgency is clearly in the business community, but not yet in the political arena. And as you said, we don't have time. Right. We have to do a lot of things now to save what can be saved and invest what can be invested.
Well, maybe we can send Elon and Vivek over here after they fix the U.S. government and reduce our regulatory burdens by 50%.
But before that, we don't need that. The IRA was really a culture shock.
Right.
Created that realization that there is another way, and that other way may be better.
Right.
And so I think it all started there, and there's probably a lot more opportunity.
Simone, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sorry.
Well, if you look at innovation, I think, and how to bring research and development and innovation into market, I think the difference is huge. Probably this is the area where both report and letter report are not, they are suggesting something very, very broad, but it's not very clear how to do, because, replicating here the ecosystem that there is in the US, putting together, how the university work, how is the relationship between private entities, government, universities, and we are not bad, for example, in terms of patenting. If you look at the green tech, Europe is pretty good in terms of patent. It's quite depressing in terms of implementation. So I think here there is a big breakthrough which is needed. I buy completely the issue on regulation. I agree with you. Elena was mentioning the fact that here in Europe, renewables today are clearly the way to go, at least until you utilize as much as possible all the land we have, because one of the problems of Europe is that we are small. And if you look at prices around Europe, today, if you want to buy cheap energy, you go to Spain. That's the reason why a lot of data centers, for example, are planning to go to Spain, just because there's a huge production of renewables, which delivers.
And like a lot of gas capacity for
and a lot of gas capacity, quite independent in terms of gas capacity. But the major reason, the main reason for the low prices comes from the huge production of renewables. So they have quite a lot of space.
Yeah.
In the rest of Europe, renewable is if you want, sorry, Elena, it's a quite simple business. It's a business where the demand is infinity. Okay. You just have to build your stuff and somebody will buy it. Huh?
Right.
If you put together, the market dynamics and the target dynamics. So what is the limited capacity? It's a permitting. So I just share with you a piece of anecdotics. In my previous life, we were working on a large project in the US. And in Texas, actually. It was a big wind project. And our boss there went together with the landowner to the office of the governor, saying, okay, now we have to go with the permitting for this. It's a huge problem. I don't remember the amount. It's a very, very big problem. So how much time do we need in order to have the permission to build? They say, well, probably a couple of weeks. The land is yours. I have no right to say anything about what you want to do with your land. I don't believe that we may jump to this kind of model. But between the 3, 4, 5 years needed in Italy, for example, or in France, to build a solar plant, and the fact that in 2 weeks you may have the permission to do everything you want in your land, there is some good intermediate position that we could try to get in Europe.
Right. Elena, your thoughts on the permitting issue would be well received, but also, much of the transition is going to be electrification, right? And we need to see electricity systems grow. The data center issue that has presented itself actually provides, I think, some interesting opportunities to make sure we get the market structure right, we get the sort of a permissive building environment so that we can do long-term decarbonization. What are your thoughts on the most pressing issues facing utilities as we look at capturing both that moment and the sort of the growth that needs to happen, right? You need to change the engine while climbing. It's not just flying.
Sure. I will say, first of all, I agree completely, both on the permitting. I mean, we have the European Permitting Act, but it still takes time. And also on the fact that industrial activity needs to follow the cheapest places around Europe. This is a way to get around it. Now, your second part was about...
How do we manage this growth issue? So
data centers.
Yeah, I mean, data centers are an immediate example.
Mm-hmm.
The case I use from the United States, in a full decarbonization scenario, should we get there, we need to have a grid basically double the size of the one we have today, right? For electrification of homes and vehicles and just meeting the economic growth. I'm presuming that number is similar in Europe, but we need to grow a lot while changing the engine. So how do you think about what are the next big challenges?
So there are opportunities to grow, and we already see that because of all these cheap renewables, we have an electrification happening in a lot of sectors that traditionally you wouldn't have electricity meeting the needs, like the EVs. You have, of course, heating. So there are two interesting bits there. One is that when it comes to heating, especially because we have climate impact affecting us, our heating needs are actually going down because we have very intense winters, but for shorter periods of time. On the contrary, cooling is skyrocketing because we are getting much warmer. So this requires serious consideration when we're thinking about the system and electricity markets and how they are stressed. But data centers, it's a whole, new world itself, especially because when we are talking to countries, increasingly they want the data center in the country. It's a matter of national security, they say.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Which was not the case, at least in Europe, like 3 years ago.
Right.
So now you have countries where permitting is an issue to develop renewable energy, the current pipeline, to develop the new loads, and then you have this huge chunk, which is a great opportunity. But at the same time, for all these good reasons, not enough land.
Right.
Data centers, they need like a lot of capacity, but it's flat. We can talk about flexibility.
Yeah.
But,
horrifically large loads that have to run all the time. Yeah. Yeah.
And, if we're talking about flexibility in the sense, yes, I have a diesel generator in my backyard, this is not really how you're flexible and you're decarbonizing.
Right.
So yes, we need a plan because this is an opportunity for Europe. This digitalization, how we're going to leverage it, innovation-wise, in this sector is moving ahead in Europe. But if we don't do it with the right conditions, then we risk having energy prices inflating for the consumers and stretching even more the current situation.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
If I may.
Yeah, please.
I think sometime we need to have the orders of magnitude in front of us. And good example is data centers versus the challenge of the energy transition. When you think about the energy transition, Europe's energy consumption is going down already, and the challenge is how to transition from the higher emission solution to the lower emission solution. The non-OECD countries will increase their energy need by 30% between now and 2050. That's where the challenge really is. It's how to enable those countries to get access to lower emission solutions and renewable as part of their mix. So I think those are interesting. There are opportunities that tend to be able to afford this type of solutions that are being put on the table. Sometimes even they're bringing their own solutions. And some are talking about, as we were talking earlier, building their own or using their own nuclear energy. Why not? I think the big picture is the energy system is a very big one with the developing countries needing a lot more energy because there will be more people, because there will be higher economic growth. That's where it's happening. Just to give you one number, between now and 2050, Europe's GDP is going to grow by $60 trillion. According to our outlook, in the developing country, it's 60. It's 10 times that.
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of that dynamic that needs to happen in order to address the risk of climate change and reduce emission and the energy transition. That's where it takes place. It's India, it's Africa, it's South America. It's
and not to argue with the numbers, but those are all AI driving massive productivity gains, which is what our hope for that technology is.
Yep.
Yeah, but like, if I may, because in Europe we have gone through, and in the US, in the developed world, through the the process of building a centralized system that has a certain size and certain needs. And in this part of the world, look at India, like the innovation in terms of solution, the leapfrogging, because these technologies are available to. So assuming that they will go down the same path that we went. I think it might be a bit underestimating what they can deliver.
Totally. And the condition, the expectations are different too, right? Like if you don't have reliable energy, who cares that the sun doesn't shine? And like if you're adding to your ability to use when you've got rooftop solar panels or whatever, right?
It's a different process.
Yeah, you're already
as they did with telecom. I mean, they just
power
jumped
system is
yeah.
already intermittent. Okay, colleagues, I've had too much time to ask these folks questions, so you should all feel obligated to offer a question.
One each.
Please give it a second of thought, but we do have a few minutes. While we do that, we didn't cover a couple things that I want to very briefly touch on with our SIMP, but you should be thinking about what your questions are. And for my panelists, I will ask for thumbs up, thumbs down answers, yes or no answers on these questions. Is CBAM going to be important for maintaining European competitiveness amidst decarbonization?
For maintaining or creating? Wait, you need to, for maintaining.
Carbon leakage protection will be critical.
Critical?
CBAM is one of the options, but carbon leakage will be...
Theoretically perfect, very complex to apply, and doesn't protect any in any way the export of European companies. So
I think it's a good idea in principle because we have seen the EU ETS working, artificially pushing prices up to promote. But I will agree with Simone here, like the application is a bit tricky.
Energy volatility.
Sorry, what I was saying is, if you don't have CBAM, you need something else. If you don't have anything, it's far worse. But I would agree, the CBAM as it's being proposed doesn't have an export element. It's quite complicated, so it needs to be adapted.
Got it. Okay, volatile energy prices. Are those going to continue to be a challenge for Europe going forward?
Yes.
Yes?
yes.
Yes?
It's the energy world, it's not specific to Europe.
I don't know, though, why people are so obsessed about volatility,
I mean, I'm an American. It looks very frightening to me. All right, excellent. Colleagues from the floor. Yes, ma'am. I'm not like Ian. I don't know anyone, so please introduce yourself.
Sorry, it's Megan Richards. I'm sorry to ask a question again, but just a question about EU-US. You discussed a number of times carbon pricing, carbon costs, carbon taxes, etc. California has huge ETS. It has a carbon price, effectively. Quebec as well. How do you see these fitting in vis-a-vis the federal system in the US and vis-a-vis EU activities, where we have, of course, a federal system, if you like, and member states?
Please, anybody who's got something to leverage. Otherwise, I'm happy to field the America question.
For me, carbon pricing is one of those perfect solutions that nobody wants. And what I mean by that, as a company, we have been supporting the concept of carbon pricing for at least a decade. And if you ask any economist what's the most efficient pathway towards decarbonization, it is carbon price. There's no question. But then you ask the policy world, the politicians, can they implement carbon pricing that impact customers? The answer is very difficult. So I think carbon pricing has proven it can work in certain circumstances. We'll probably have to look at other alternatives like carbon intensity standards, other ways to get products. For me, the intent ultimately is, I was mentioning this market-based mechanisms. How do we make products bought by customers, the low carbon version preferred to the high carbon version? Mm-hmm. How do we incentivize the buyer to make the choice that will be low carbon? We're not yet there, but that's, I think, should be the intent. And how do we use tools that may not be a tax, may lead to the same result would be helpful. Because ultimately, we need to find a way to have a demand-driven transition where the customer buys the low carbon option.
Mm-hmm. After 20 years, more or less, of our application of ETS, we don't have any evidence that ETS worked on much more than pushing out of the market coal plants, which is good. But probably you could have done the same in a simple way. But anyway, I don't believe that you have to change it now, because more or less we are in an equilibrium. It gives price signals, but if you want to invest in renewables, basically nobody invests in renewable plants just because of carbon price, for example. So we need something probably more, CFDs, price stabilization mechanism, etc. I tend to buy what you were saying. I believe it's very important, especially for decarbonizing the energy-intensive sector, to find a way to work more with the carrots, also in Europe. You did it quite a lot with the IRA, for example. The US. Probably exploring and trying to make more general and comprehensive the model of carbon contract for difference may be quite interesting. Also, in order to define a market for off-takers. So, large energy-intensive customers could have an interest in buying newly built renewables if there is some mechanism enabling them to stabilize their costs and to make evident for them what is the benefit of decarbonizing.
Another colleague from the floor has a question. I think we have a question. We have time for one or two more.
I was going to add, because what you touched on something very important, but I think at the heart of your question is, how will it work? I think the more we look at it, and the more when we look at the cost of the energy transition over the full cycle, one thing we're now convinced of is subsidies is not the way to go. Subsidies can help prime the pump, can help bring new technologies to market, scale them up initially. But after that, if you don't have a market mechanism, the governments will not going to be able to pay the huge gap that exists. You need to close the gap and find a way to make the low carbon stuff preferable so that the customer buys it. You don't have a government to subsidize it.
Well, in the case of the United States, it's not sure we can pay for what we already pledged either. Gentlemen right there.
This is working. Is it working?
Yeah, they turn it on.
I thought it was quite ironical to hear just now, if I heard correctly, that the IRA in America has been a more effective instrument of industrial policy than anything we've had in Europe, in the sense that, it's Europe that's always focused on industrial policy. And to answer the question, what instruments do we have in Europe? Not many is the answer. And the answer really is competition and state aid policy. And that's where, I guess, it worked in America with the IRA, right? The problem I see, this turning point in European history, as we wait for the next 5 years, I look at the agenda of the Commission. I look at the portfolios allocated by von der Leyen to the various 27 commissioners, and it's a huge mess. To be honest, I could go on for hours about this, but so my question really can be summed up in one word, which is prioritization. What I've heard today is just, unequivocal about the need to focus, apart from the security generally, but on energy and climate change and the combination of those policies. How this Commission will do it, I'm not sure. I think we rely a lot on the European Council, the heads of state and government, giving us clear direction to the Commission. Should be the other way around in a way. But otherwise, in 50 years in Brussels, as a trade negotiator, trade is easy. We've got an article, 207 of the treaty, which gives us exclusive competence. Industrial policy, there ain't no article in the treaty.
Right.
All right, so it's a real uphill struggle with 27 very different member states, given the right under the treaty to have their different energy policies and structures and sources and all that sort of stuff. Well, sorry, negative comment.
No, it's not a negative comment. Let me turn it into a question. Think tank events are for defining priorities of the incoming government. So why don't, from each of our panelists, we'll go start with Elena and we'll move down the line. What would you hope to see them work on in the first year, or and what are the priorities that you think need to be addressed most immediately?
Permitting, definitely the first one. It will work for all of us when it's resolved. They will work on clean industrial policy. We know that. There will, Clean Industrial Act is a priority. And then the digital stuff, so the intersection between digitalization and energy, that's something that I would like to see. But
Simone, we're building an exclusive list, so we need, in addition to permitting and the Clean Industry Act.
I think the issue is implementing. I think all the frame is there. Net Zero Industrial Act, Critical Raw Material Act, so that's fantastic. The problem is, again, is how. And how means going straight to the point, giving resources where needed, simplifying the procedures and integrating the models and regulation. The alternative is just going ahead with state aids, with a fragmentation based on state aid, which would be, maybe it works a little bit, but will be a disaster in terms of coherency and integrity of the market.
Great. Philippe?
I think when you ask the business sector what they want to see is urgent simplification. And the way I would describe it in simple words. When you are in the hole and you continue to dig, the first thing you do is stop digging, and then you try to get out. Right now, over the past 5 years, we have seen a huge influx on regulation. Of the past 2, despite very clear signal that Europe was going through major competitiveness challenges, regulations have been coming. So I think the first thing we would like to see is what I would call a pause and reset type approach, starting with very concrete actions stemming from the Draghi report. Take the sustainability framework, the CSRD, the CSDDD, put them through a competitiveness check, and before you fully implement, you implement the learnings from the competitiveness check. Very strong signal that the Commission, the Council are serious and taking the issue with the first and highest priority in mind and making that transformation real. Right now it's words, it's there. Everybody talks about competitiveness, but we urgently need concrete action to give confidence to investors.
Great. Thank you, Philippe, Simone, Elena, for sharing your insights and wisdom with us all today. Colleagues, if you wouldn't mind joining me in a warm appreciation of our panelists. And I believe that we are going to step out for a 5-minute break, 10-minute break. Excellent.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon again. If I could ask you all to take a seat so we can start our final session. Please do have a seat. Thank you.
I feel like it just got 10 degrees warmer up here.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Ewa Krukowska. I'm a senior energy and climate correspondent at Bloomberg News. And I have the pleasure of moderating this panel about transatlantic perspectives. We already discussed geopolitics at a time of a conflict. We already discussed competitiveness and supply chains. And now we'll try to look at whether the EU and the US can align. The topic couldn't be more timely. We just had European elections in the EU. In a couple of days, the new Commission, led by Ursula von der Leyen again, but with different commissioners in the college, will start. The expected date is the 1st of December. Next month, in January, President-elect Donald Trump will return to the White House. And in the meanwhile, we are seeing very interesting developments in energy markets. Europe needs to ensure stable security of supply. President von der Leyen said that lowering energy prices is one of her key priorities for the next term. And the reserves of gas in the European Union are being depleted faster than last year. My guests in this panel today are Russell Ross, Energy Attaché at the US Department of Energy Office at the US Mission to the European Union, and Tibor Stelbacki, Principal Advisor on Energy Diplomacy at the European External Action Service. And Tibor, my first question goes to you. What does energy security mean for the EU, and what are the priorities for the next term?
Yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really very pleased and privileged to be here at this conference. Energy security, I think, it's crystal clear that in a situation when a region is dependent on energy sources, it's a huge extent, then the energy security is a very important priority. This is already for a long time an EU priority, and we are talking always about the clean, affordable and secure energy supply. My memories tell me that time to time it was somewhere else on the priority. Sometimes it was on the clean, sometimes it was on the competitive, and sometimes on the affordability, which also means the competitiveness, sometimes on the security. Now, in these days, and it's mainly because of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and weaponizing the energy in this conflict towards Europe, definitely the energy security, the security of supply is the most important part. So if we look at also the new Commission and the strategic agenda for the new Commission, definitely this is an issue to make sure that Europe has the security, has the supply of gas and oil mainly to Europe. And the number two, if we are talking about priorities, but of course we will probably talk more on this is also on the affordability or the price, because as you know very well that for the new Commission, one of the major priority will be the European competitiveness, the global competitiveness. And of course, if we are looking at this, then the energy price is a major factor. So also, when we follow the hearing of the new Commissioner designate for Energy, Dan Jorgensen, he said in the hearings in the European Parliament that one of the most urgent and important tasks of his portfolio is a report and a communication and the possible solutions how to tackle the higher energy prices. So security of supply, this is a must. We learned in 22 how difficult this is. And right after this, also the affordability and on the price issue.
Russ, has the definition of energy security changed for the EU? What do you expect in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I don't think so, right? I mean, I violently agree, I think, on this point, that energy security, the definition of that remains the same, that it was 100 years ago, that it is now, and that it will be, right? It's maintaining that reliable and affordable supply of energy, whatever that form may come in, whether it's sort of traditional hydrocarbons, clean energy, nuclear, you name it, it's providing the energy so that our societies can do the work that it needs to do to maintain our modern industrial lives. So I think that changes, or that doesn't change at all. You know, what can change is sort of the pathway to get to that objective, right? Sort of which supplies you may focus on, which types of fuels, what the supply chains look like. But I think generally speaking, no, energy security will remain what it has. The overall objective will remain the same, no matter who's in office in the White House.
Tibor, before we discuss the future, let's discuss a little bit about the past. How did the cooperation between the EU and the US evolve in the past couple of years, and what do you see as the biggest opportunities and challenges for the future?
Yeah, as we know very well that the US has been in a major change in the energy policy, let's say in the last 2 decades or maybe even more. But from a country which was also depending on others, on the supply-wise, from thanks to the fracking technology and the heavy investments in production, gas and oil, became first self-supplier and then also to open for export markets. There was always cooperation between the two countries, two regions. I must emphasize that this is not between Brussels and Washington, it's between the economies and the companies, which is led by the market rules and very much led also if we are talking about LNG, the market, the prices on the market. Europe was in a, I would say, comfortable situation. We already now see and learn that how dangerous this comfortable situation was, because we believed, or big part of Europe believed, that the Russian gas and oil is a reliable supply. So Russia is a reliable partner. And it led, unfortunately, we learned this lesson very heavily in 22, that it's led to a full-fledged energy crisis and perfect storm, or we can name it anyway. So if you are dependent hugely on one supplier, then it could create very major difficulties for the economy. What we saw recently, as I mentioned, after the Russian aggression, that the Russian supply decreased heavily, not just with the start of the war. Already in the summer and the autumn of 21, it was less gas coming from Russia to Europe. So we were there 2 years ago in 22, in the summer, in the spring and the summer, and we saw that it's very likely that huge part of the gas import from Russia will be out of the market. So Europe was badly needed support from others, and this situation was very much reflected on the prices. So the demand was practically the same, the supply was much less, prices went up high, and it was a very good indication for the global energy market, including, of course, the US producers and traders, to direct the LNG towards Europe, and it was a life-saving in 22. So if I remember well, that the US LNG just growth from some 15 or 20 billion cubic meter to 50. The Russian in the same time decreased from 140 to first to 60 and then even further down. So, you know, from practical terms, this just demonstrates that the US support and the US supply was super important. More on institutional, let's say, or structural way, we just discussed with Russ that we have I think, a very good functioning platform to discuss energy issues. This is the EU-US Energy Council. It has working groups on technology and also on security of supply, and it gives in every year an opportunity to go through on all joint challenges, joint problems, and common issues, and to find a solution to this. On the challenges and the future, I think we will come to this anyhow, that for the new administration in Washington, this is something what we need to see. We will see after 20th of January, what are the indications. So far, it shows that probably it will move into the direction, the administration in Washington, to more support for the fossil fuel production and industry. We very much hope that given to the fact that US and the European Union represent almost 40% of the world GDP, more than 30% of the world trade, 1.5 trillion euro world trade, the links are so close to each other that also in a changing, let's say, approach in the administration in Washington, this dialogue and this forum, this cooperation will remain. I think we will come later more in details on different parts, but if we are talking about the expectations, I think it's just right after the elections in the US, President von der Leyen said that we are very ready to work with the new administration based on our common values, common challenges, and common interest, which is in the US and in the EU there.
Russ, will LNG be the new basis for even deeper cooperation energy-wise? Like, will President von der Leyen and President Trump see eye to eye when it comes to this?
So that, I mean, I guess where I'm safe as a public official now is just sort of to talk about what is in the realm of the LNG exports now, right? So right now we have in the U.S. roughly 140 billion cubic meters a year of export capacity, right, of existing LNG facilities. We have another roughly 120 BCM, give or take, set to be completed by the end of this decade. So nearly double our current capacity. We expect to be the largest LNG exporter by about 50% by that time, by 2030. And so that's just baseline as of today, no matter who's in the White House, right? Those investments have either been made and completed or are being made. And then there's an additional, I think it's roughly 200 BCM of projects that are approved, authorized, and are waiting for FID, right? So huge amounts of gas. And we've talked with a number of producers in the US that say they can produce a lot more in the US, right? There's a lot of infrastructure bottlenecks in the US now that, if unlocked, would allow for huge amounts of molecules to come out in addition to what's already there. So as to what the next administration is going to do, I won't speak to it. I won't speak to it now. I think the line that we give is right. We have one president at a time, and so we will continue to serve this administration until the changeover on January 20th. But I think LNG has been, as Tibor noted, a critical piece of our relationship since even before 2022, but certainly after February of 2022, it became a critical piece of our energy security cooperation. And luckily, both sides of the Atlantic were fortunate to be in a position where that took place. And so our objective from previous administrations as well, to liberalize global gas markets, I mean, luckily we were able to do that and able to help our European partners and allies get through a very difficult 2021 through 23.
In terms of gas and security of supply in Europe, the US recently, last week, imposed sanctions on Gazprom Bank. Why did it do so, and how will it impact European security of energy supply? Because some companies, some member states are saying that it wasn't a move that would help.
So I think, right, as we see it, it's an implementation of the G7 commitments that have been made, right? Our objective has been within that realm to increase the pressure on Russia and do our best to reduce revenues to the Russian government, to restrict what they can do in their warfighting capacity. And so what was done last week on Gazprom Bank and other designations, I think, is just a continuation of U.S. and partner and ally policy, right? As we all know, right, sanctioning global energy markets, it's a challenging thing to do, and we don't do it lightly. And so we're trying to massage and figure out what works, what doesn't work, and we consult with our partners and allies at all times. And we sort of, right, you have to tailor that, you have to walk that fine line between implementing sanctions that have an effect on the target of those sanctions, and minimizing or mitigating the impacts on the implementer of those sanctions. And so it's a fine line to walk, and we are doing what we think is our best to do that.
Tibor, is the European Commission, are diplomats in Brussels talking to member states about the impact? And also, if the role of Russian gas in Europe is going to decline, how are we going to get there?
Yes, there are talks, of course, formally and informal as well. In mid-December, there will be Energy Council here in Brussels again. I'm sure that it will be on the agenda, the kind of winter preparedness, and also what will be after the finishing the Ukraine gas transit agreement. Maybe it would be good to see a bit, in concrete terms, that what does it mean, the Russian gas now in Europe. So as I mentioned, it was some 140 billion cubic meter before the war, so in 2021. Now is somewhere around 35 or 40 billion cubic meter. On pipeline, this is something 15 or 20. I don't recall exactly the number. But a bit bigger part is now the LNG from Russia, which was interesting. The last 2 years increased. So if we are talking about the sanction, also in the gas transit, then we have to separate the two issues from each other. On the pipeline, this is actually, I would say that still 3 Central European landlocked countries who get gas on LNG from pipeline from Russia. Maybe if we put Serbia also as a candidate country, then 4, and maybe some around a bit. So these are the kind of target, if I'm talking about pipeline, which is in a way a tricky situation because, you know, here very much there is a determination of the infrastructure of the pipeline. So if there is no Russian gas on the existing pipelines, that they need to get it from somewhere else. What I know that Austria always said that they are able to replace the Russian gas in theory if it's needed. Serbia and Hungary get it through the Turk stream, so not anymore on Ukraine. Slovakia is the most exposed to this issue. But if I'm talking about Slovakia, this is something 5 billion cubic meters. So it's, I think, if you look at the whole energy market, it was also in the first panel, it was mentioned, the energy union, energy market. Europe, and this is also the Commission position, Europe can handle this situation. On the LNG, this is a bit different because on LNG, of course, this is a free global market. One player are the Russians. Why they are increasing the sellings? Because the price is lower, and legally there is no any sanctions on gas. So now also with the Gazprom Bank sanction issue, the question is really the compliance and the implementation, and it's still relatively early phase. So we need. That's what is going on in the Commission and also in the ES and the member states to analyze this presidential decree and the implementing rules. There is also kind of deadlines how it will enter into force. So to see this, it's too early to say what is the solution. I would not exclude that it would have a major impact on some countries who are dependent on the pipeline in Central Europe. But it cannot be also excluded that, you know, we are talking here companies in the market who will find a way how to do this, which, you know, can be considered as a circumvention of sanction or others. That's why I mentioned the compliance, because it's sometimes the over-compliance is also an issue that countries are refraining to do something if they are uncertain that it have some consequences. And if I understand correctly, the Gazprom Bank sanction, the major point of the Gazprom Bank sanction is to cut the link to the international financial system, the dollar-based system. So companies who are dealing still with the Gazprom Bank will risk this. So that's which is the major point of the discussions now. Still, sometimes it's needed to look at the concrete impacts on this.
How important is the gas transit via Ukraine, given the war, given calls by Naftogaz, for example, that it's the continuation of transit is needed to ensure that the gas infrastructure in Ukraine is being protected?
So I think from a U.S. perspective, right, we support the EU and its member states' decision to transition off Russian supplies of energy, right? And on the LNG front, as we talked about, we're fortunate enough to be in a position to have those molecules be available, sort of same on oil to a certain extent. On the gas transit through Ukraine, right, that is a decision for the Ukrainians to make, and certainly in conjunction with, well, not in conjunction, but you know, Brussels and member states that are impacted by that will have a say, right? And their sort of companies are likely having those discussions, but you know, we're not from a USG perspective sort of putting our thumb on the scale for that. We want to see and are working towards supporting our European partners and allies to enhance energy security here. And again, supporting their decision to transition off Russian supplies by 2027, right? If not earlier in some instances, if they can. So I think, right, time will tell what happens, right? We're all sort of watching the end of this calendar year and what will happen come January 1. But for those that are veterans of the energy world, I mean, sort of anything can happen between now and December 31st, January 1st. But you know, it's again, we're here to support our European partners and allies to the best that we can.
It's just a gentle reminder for everyone who follows energy not to party too much on the 1st of January and the New Year's Eve. Right. A question on sanctions again, because the EU hasn't sanctioned Russian gas. It has become partner in the coalition to sanction Russian oil. Should we tighten the sanctions?
Well, in theory, we can say yes, because if there is a proposal, then member states to decide on this. On gas, there were some member states, especially one, which was very clear that they are not agreeing anything which can risk the security of supply. It goes back to this pipeline dependency, so and landlocked countries. So it might be, but as we know, in the sanction policy, it's need unanimity. So now this is the Hungarian presidency. Of course, they are not so keen to deal with this. Even the Commission is not so keen to propose now something, but from 1st of January it will be Poland. And the well-known, the Polish position towards Russia. So as a presidency, they will probably very happy to see and to lead the negotiations on a new sanction package, maybe also on the gas supply. So whether it will be successful and there will be unanimity on this or not, this is a question, but this is of course what we saw in the past 2 and almost 3 years already, and what will be for the next year. This is something what we need to see in the dynamic of the negotiations in the Council.
Russ, from the US perspective, how does the price cap on Russian oil impact global energy security?
So I mean, it gets back to what I had mentioned earlier, like you know, placing sanctions on an important sector to the economy, like energy sector, oil, gas, whatever it is challenging, right? I mean, I think we've been pretty clear that the intent of the oil price cap was to limit revenues, reduce where we can, and limit revenues to the Russian government, while at the same time ensuring sufficient barrels on the market to not, you know, again, the focus of sanctions are to impact the target of the sanctions more than the implementer. So it's a fine line to walk in this space. We have continued to have sort of dialogue with, again, our partners and allies in this space, with industry as well, to make sure that economic operators are aware of the sanctions in place, sort of the risks that come with operating in this space. We've taken action in the past to try and enhance price cap compliance, and you know, and we're always exploring what options there are to try and tighten that compliance and make sure that we're doing so in a way, again, that impacts and hurts the target of those sanctions, vice anyone else. So, you know, it was a carefully crafted piece of sanctions policy to try and get after a certain issue, and so. You know, nobody's claiming that anything that we do is perfect in nature, but it is something that we're trying to do and constantly are assessing the impacts and then analyzing what we can do to tweak it, because this is right. It's a sort of a game of, maybe not cat and mouse, but whack-a-mole. Where we're trying to just figure out what works and where we can have impact. But again, you know, time will tell what the next few months will bring in this space. I don't have any insights one way or the other, but you saw, again, you mentioned the Gazprom bank sanctions, so this administration is still taking effort to try and have effect in that space. So, you know, we'll see what the future holds.
If I may, on this, because I was not replying on the oil. So, indeed, in the EU there is a ban on oil import into the EU, with an exemption of pipelines where it's not replaceable with other sources. And there is a price cap where the EU is participating. It's a bit like, you know, maybe it's not a perfect comparison, but like in the tobacco trades, if you have very strict rules on the tobacco, it will create an illegal market. And the policymaker should also consider a bit that if it's too strong, that everything will move to the uncontrollable illegal market, and people will get anyway the tobacco, but it will be even worse than the normal. So a bit the price cap is also similar. The problem is here that there is an illegal market. This is the shadow fleet. So here really the implementation is the point. How we, which means the oil price coalition, can implement this and to force Russia to, or to make impossible to use the shadow fleet and channel in within the price cap, which is the $60 and the $100, with all the insurances and all the ancillary services on this. This is difficult because, of course, there are interested parties, let's put it this way, who want to circumvent this price cap. But you know, I don't think that if we would thinking about you know, lowering this $60 and the $100, then it would have much major impact on the incomes of Russia. Maybe it would be even more to push into the shadow fleet thing. So I think, and there are a lot of measures from the US, from the UK, from Europe as well, on individual tankers, and also to practice, best practice, how to really implement this price cap mechanism.
Oil is very important, gas is very important, but it's not the only policy areas in terms of EU-US energy cooperation. What is the outlook, Russ, for US investments in clean tech, in renewable energy in Europe?
So, I mean, I think there's sufficient capital out there to invest in all forms of energy. I think at the end of the day, it's incumbent upon whatever technology you're talking about to make itself an enticable thing to invest in, right? So I think there's capital in the U.S. markets. I think there's, I guess I'll just give some data points, right? Because I do tend to try and rely on that as much as I can. So under the first Trump administration, between 2016 and 2019, electricity from wind grew by 100%. I'm sorry, solar grew by 100%. Between 2016 and 2019, solar grew by, I think it was 30%. Coal reduced by almost a quarter, and renewables overall between 16 and 19 jumped up by almost 30%. So I think that what that just goes to show is that, you know, if there are market incentives there and it's an environment that people think they can make money in, then they'll invest in those technologies. And so I think whatever the next administration does, and I can't speak to what the next administration will do on the IRA, but I think whatever the case is, there's capital to invest, and if the market environment is there, in the U.S. or in Europe, the corollary is for Europe as well. Right? There's been a lot of talk about constraints on capital or the need for capital union market, things like that. Again, if it is an environment where people think they can make money and risk is relatively low compared to other places, they'll invest in it. So I think that's I'm optimistic in that sense that no matter who's in office anywhere, I think there's opportunity.
There are always opportunities. The market is working well, but what about trade measures? Like, do you see any risks from the trade measures as flagged by President-elect if they materialize?
I would play a lot of lotto if I could predict this. But you know what we know, that really what was in the campaign, what is in different papers and documents and statements, and also we now see also the member of the new administration, the secretaries might have some view that what will be the priority. I think that at least what the literature said about tariff measures, that maybe in short term it can be beneficial for one region, but in longer term it will be harmful. We were talking in the first panel, there was a lot of talks that the kind of old world is over and there will be something new. So whether this let's say rule is still valid or not, I don't know. But I think that the strength of the US and also the strength for the EU is, and in this sense is a common interest, this is the free market and global market in the world. If it starts a kind of war of tariffs, then I think it will be just in medium and longer term just harmful for everybody. And again, if we, and it's not me the best who can tell this, but if I understand well, Philip, on companies, that for them it's really the investment and the return, which is this is our system, what we believe and still believe, and also I think President-elect Trump believed it best in the world. So it will be a lead on this. Then it will, for the investments, for the cooperation, it should keep the room for the good cooperation. Let it be renewable, let it be technology, let it be fossil fuels, gas and oil and others for a mutual beneficial way. Because I think, it was also mentioned in one of the early panel that the non-action and the price of the non-action. So we can find a lot of models and everything. But just to ask the people in Valencia, or now it's dry, I think in New York and New Jersey, ask the insurance companies that what is the insurance for properties and for others as well. So this, which I think it's happening now, that the climate is changing and there are these extreme weather conditions, it will have a price, and then surely it will really indicate a way how the companies and the market and the policymakers should look at these questions.
Time is running out very, very quickly. We could talk about this topic, I guess, for hours, but before we start wrapping up slowly, I will be happy to take a couple of questions from the floor, if there are any, and I'm sure that there are. You're just being a little bit shy. I understand that it's the end of the day almost, but here we go. If you could introduce yourself.
Alan Riley, College of Europe, and I was going to talk about the Ukrainian gas contract, potential expiry on the 31st of December. Basically, what's your kind of pitch? My understanding of where do you think we're going to go? I mean, the point I understand about the Gazprom Bank sanctions is that it interacts very neatly with the Russian presidential decree. So the point I understand is that under the Russian presidential decree of April 2022, we're in a situation where all long-term supply contracts with Gazprom have to be cleared via Gazprom Bank. So by sanctioning, effectively, the sanctions rest upon the Russian presidential decree. So to a degree, Putin would have to lose some face to change that. So there's an issue about that, the impact on secondary sanctions. So that surely creates one problem. The second problem is litigation, as I understand it, with all the cases being brought against Gazprom for effectively failing to fill their long-term supply contracts in 2022. One of them is the OMV case, which resulted in the cut of supplies to OMV. Now, the question there is economic, in the sense that if OMV I understand roughly half the supply of gas going through Ukrainian through the Ukrainian system is going to Austria. So that undermines presumably the economics of it, and there's the prospect of a lot more litigation. I understand there's at least 20 other arbitration awards on the way against Gazprom, so that creates a huge disincentive for Gazprom. And you can see the problem. You bring gas through the transit, through the Ukrainian transit system, and somebody else seizes your income receivables. So on the top of all the other geopolitical issues and the problems, the technical issues to do with interconnection agreements between Gazprom and the Ukrainian gas transit system operator, all of that together, my question is should we be operating on the principle that they may be able to pull a post-Soviet rabbit out of the hat, but it looks very likely that we are looking at the end of the Ukrainian transit system on the 31st of December. And then the question is the EU in principle and the US prepared? I mean, it's okay, 5% of the European gas market, which we're talking about here, 5% of the consumption. But it's not, in overall terms, at the height of winter, that could have an impact. And of course, who knows, perhaps the Russians would see that as an opportunity for a bit of extra sabotage at the same time to ump the impact of the end. So that's my question is, do we think it's going to be what's your pitch on where we're going to go? And are we prepared for the worst case scenario? Apology for the rather long-winded question.
Oh, good.
No, once again, so we definitely, if there are a lot of talks about the Ukrainian transit and a lot of uncertainties, we already see in the prices that it brings up. If we assume, and actually this is the official Kiev view, that the transit agreement will cease and there will be no transit through Ukraine, the lesson what we learned in the last, let's say, 3 years or 2 winters, that you have to be prepared for this kind of situation. So, you know, the storage is still quite highly filled. There are even EU rules and the solidarity mechanism among the member states. Indeed, as you mentioned, this is 5%, so globally in Europe, in some countries, of course, this is very significant, but these are not the biggest countries in the EU. So it hopefully, and this is what the Commission says, and all the models of the Commission said, and also with cooperation with the member states, that that if there is no gas coming through Ukraine from 1st of January, then this is manageable. It will be costly, so it will be not cheap to manage. It will have more withdrawal from the storages. It will have probably put the prices again high. You know, we learned already and get used to it that if there is a strike in Australia in an LNG terminal, then the European gas price will go up. So it's really everything. Every news has an impact on the gas. But I think that, you know, if nothing else, which was learned in Europe for this gas crisis, that you have to be prepared, and be prepared for the worst situation. Be prepared that it will be expensive, so it will be not cheap. But if the question is really to have the heating, have the economy to run also in the first months of next year, then unfortunately this price should be paid. And to face this situation. So, but as I mentioned, as I started, we don't know yet what will be the result. What we know that there are talks in closed doors and behind the scene on different solutions and different issues. You know, it's important to say that this is, of course, mainly companies who are discussing these issues and try to find solutions on this, going into the risk of the compliance issues, as I mentioned. But from the other side, there is also a need for the security of supply. So, complex issue, definitely. In theory, I think the European Union is ready for this. It will be not cheap and it will be not easy to do this. But let's see that what is really the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just agree 100%. I mean, if we did know what it would be like, again, I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be, you know, trading commodities or playing the lotto or doing something if I knew the future. I mean, I think at the end of the day, right, the Gazprom designation, Gazprom brand designation, it was, so I mean, it's something that the U.S. government, G7 partners and allies, and others, I mean, we've been signaling or telling folks for quite some time that our objective is to continue to tighten where we can. And so we've consistently made adjustments and made new designations as they roll out pretty frequently. So, and this is one of the, you know, the last sort of large banks that hadn't been designated and still had connection to the international financial system. So from that standpoint, it's, we don't, you know, based on what we've seen so far, it doesn't, you know, it seems like the market and industry players probably already factored this in, right, for the most part. It, you know, so it's this sort of continues sort of a set of actions that we've been taking since February of 22. So from that standpoint, yeah, it's not necessarily surprising, I would think. And then as far as being prepared, as Tibor said, I mean, Europe has done a ton of great work to try and get prepared at this point, to build the necessary infrastructure within Europe to allow for optionality of supplies, which I think is critical, right? If they didn't have that, if they didn't have the north-south or vertical corridor or other interconnections or reverse flow capabilities, they'd be in a much different position now than they are. So I think from that, again, right, kudos to Europe for taking those efforts and trying to get ahead of this.
We can take one more question.
Thank you. I think at this point everyone knows I'm the other Elena in the room, not the one that spoke in the previous panel. Research Service of the European Parliament. A quick question. Preparedness was mentioned at some point, and I understand that from the geopolitical environment, both in the EU and the US, the resilience of energy-related critical infrastructure is going to increase. So in that domain, do you think the upcoming US administration and the EU would be likely to work together bilaterally, through NATO, through G7 at all? Any comments you might have on that? Thank you.
So, I mean, I would say all of the above, likely. I think to the point that a question you had raised earlier about where we are in our energy security collaboration, I mean, there's there are a lot of platforms that we engage at a government-to-government level. The U.S.-EU Energy Council, for a while there was a U.S.-EU Task Force on Energy Security after the February 2022. There are the Trade and Technology Council, there's the G7 work, G20 work, IEA discussions. There's so many platforms where we exchange perspectives and experiences and try and work together to enhance our critical infrastructure protection. There's even on the cybersecurity front, right, all these things. So I think it will continue to play a critical role in our collaboration going forward. And it gets back to the question you asked about energy security. I mean, that underpins, like I said, everything. And I know we all know this in this room, but I mean, energy is the economy. Energy is economic security. And if we're both in a good place, and a secure place from an energy supply standpoint, that puts us both in a much stronger position to deal with other issues. So maybe that's a long way of saying yes. Yes.
And I fully agree, so that's too much to add. Maybe just one point that, of course, this is one of the biggest challenge, a new challenge, because literally you can anytime and everywhere accept some attack. So, you know, preparedness, it's really maybe the greatest challenge on this field, and the implications can be, of course, very, very, very difficult. So this is an area where I think whatever administration is in Washington and governments in Europe, our interest is so much 100% the same that our cooperation is a must.
And before we call it an end, I will hand over to Ian.
Well, the first thing I'm going to do is thank you, Eva, very much for moderating this, and also to thank our speakers in the last session. And you'll just allow me in closing a few thanks. On behalf of GMF, first of all, to PPC, George Stasis, thank you so much for being with us, to you and your team, Elena. It's always a great pleasure, and a great pleasure to have this conversation, which I hope you all found good. I certainly did. And there's a lot going on in the world to talk about. Let me also thank CSIS and our friends, not only for working with us, but also for being with us today. And that's a great pleasure for us. It's an ongoing project, so please look out for other things that we're doing. Great thanks to all the speakers who are with us today. We really appreciate it. And allow me a special word of thanks to my colleagues from GMF who put all of this together. There were a lot of them, as you could see, but allow me very special thanks to Alberto and Hermine and to Antoine, who are really working specifically on this over the last weeks. I'm very grateful to you. Finally, thanks to all of you for joining us. And we look forward to having you with us here in person or online. I know a lot of people joined us today. Anyway, very much looking forward to having you with us here again. Thank you so much.